So Directors General, Deputy Director General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, both here in the WTO building, as well as following us through the live webcast on YouTube. A good afternoon to all of you from the WTO here in Geneva. My name is Wolfmar Evert. I'm the Secretary of the Council for TRIPS, and I would like to welcome you to this high-level dialogue to celebrate 30 years of the TRIPS agreement. And to open this event, we are delighted to be joined this afternoon by the Directors General of both the WTO and the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, two international institutions that have worked together closely throughout the past 30 years to help members operate, implement, and benefit from the TRIPS agreement. So to get us underway, I therefore have the honor to invite Mr. Darren Tang, Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization, to open this event. Director General.
Thank you so much, Wolf. Director General Ngozi of the World Trade Organization, Deputy Director General Joanna Hill, Excellencies, dear friends, dear colleagues. Thank you for this chance to be with you as we not just celebrate 30 years of the TRIPS agreement, but also what can be achieved through multilateralism, international dialogue, and collaboration. Birthdays are occasions for celebration, but also opportunities for reflection. So in tracing the journey of TRIPS, I want to start by looking back not just 30 years, but 550 years to the Republic of Venice, where the first patent law was established in 1474. This new law to protect new and ingenious devices was a very significant development. Innovation and creativity has been part of who we are since time immemorial. Our ancestors discovered fire, the arrow, pottery, the wheel, agriculture, etc., etc. They expressed themselves through cave art, bone flutes, and sculptures. Many of our ancient civilizations have left us great legacies of art, literature, poetry. So simply put, we have been inventing, innovating, creating for thousands of years. But the establishment of the first IP system in Venice was a game changer because it allowed a new idea to be much more closely connected to society and the market, allowing a much larger group of people to participate in deciding whether this innovation would be useful or not, rather than just a patron, a feudal lord, or a king. I believe that history, in fact, is full of the graves of great inventions that died with their inventors. From Venice, the idea of an IP system spread throughout the world, and about 150 years ago, 140 years ago, the first few international IP treaties were established, laying for the foundations for a global IP system with the Paris and Bern Conventions. The TRIPS agreement, and of course, the establishment of WIPO before that, is part of this larger arc of history. And of course, the TRIPS agreement, though, was groundbreaking because it's the first to directly connect the world of IP with that of trade and investment. This again ushered a new chapter in the development of the global IP system. WIPO was there at the birth of the TRIPS agreement, and while there were admittedly some understandable anxieties about the role of WIPO, right from the start, I'm very happy to say that there was a very strong effort on the part of both agencies, WIPO and the WTO, to work together to find complementarities. And not many people know this in this room, but for some of the those around a bit longer, you may know that WIPO was called on and responded fully to the request that it help WTO members implement their TRIPS obligations. We have done so and continued doing so over the many years. And in doing so, we have supported at least 130 developing and least developed countries with legal and technical assistance related to the implementation of TRIPS. I'm pleased that this spirit of complementariness, collaboration, and partnership continues today. Just last November, WIPO and WTO co-organized the 19th edition of the Colloquium for the Teachers of IP. We had the honor of hosting them for 1 week at WIPO's premises last year. And later this year, we will deliver a joint executive program for senior government officials, enhancing national expertise in IP law, including around TRIPS. And to cite just one example that's focused a bit more on technical assistance, WIPO's graduation support program for LDCs is helping Angola, Laos, and Sao Tome and Principe to use the TRIPS agreement and IP in general as a catalyst for growth and development. And as part of this work, we've organized joint workshops with WTO, and so the LDC officials can focus on certain very technical matters. And of course, I do not need to mention the trilateral work that my sister Ngozi and my brother Tedros working across WTO, WHO, and WIPO to bring the expertise of all three agencies to help address IP, health, and supply chain issues. Member states have supported and appreciated this way of working. And so with your encouragement, we intend to continue doing so in order to support everyone to use IP as a catalyst for growth and development. Dear colleagues and friends, looking back at just the last 30 years, the global IP and innovation landscape has dramatically transformed. In 1994, cross-border payments related to IP amounted to around $70 billion. In 2022, this figure had grown to almost $1 trillion. But the countries driving this growth has changed and become far more diversified. If we look at the top 20 IP exporters by value, we see traditional powerhouses like the US, Germany, and Japan, but now joined by the BRICS economies like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And with smaller countries like Ireland, UAE, and Singapore, I have to mention Singapore, carving out strategic niches. These dynamics echo broader IP trends. Back when the TRIPS negotiations began in 1986, IP was still dominated by a handful of developed countries, with over 60% of patent applications coming from the G7. Today, these countries still contribute enormously to the global IP system, but they have been joined by a much wider range of IP growth engines. In fact, 70% of all IP filings now come from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In my conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, innovators, and creators on the ground and all over the world, I see a common desire to make use of innovation, technology, digitalization, and entrepreneurship to drive growth. In fact, WIPO's global survey of 25,000 laypersons last year from 50 countries show that laypersons in Africa and Asia have a more positive attitude towards IP than those in Europe and North America. So the world has changed. At the same time, what we are seeing, if we project a bit to the future, is that IP and trade will become even more interconnected, and so TRIPS will become even more relevant. Just look at trade in digital services over the past 2 decades. It has grown by over 8% a year, well ahead trade in goods and other services. Even in last year's tough trading environment, digital exports rose by 9% to a value well above $4 trillion. So I think we're entering a world where innovators and creators are increasingly from all parts of the world, increasingly interconnected through trade that's increasingly digital. And hopefully this will lead to an innovation landscape that's not only more vibrant, more dynamic, but also more inclusive. We have to say nice things on birthdays, but I hope you believe me when I say that I'm not just being nice, but sincere in saying that the rules set out by TRIPS have helped to support innovation, providing businesses and entrepreneurs increasingly from the developing countries with the certainty and predictability that they need to operate across borders and bring their ideas to the world. And while it is very much the prerogative for members to want to improve on the agreements which they are party to, let us also take today to acknowledge the contributions of TRIPS over the many years, which is the symbol of multilateral cooperation that it represents, and the power of IP to serve as a tool to incentivize innovation, bring an idea to the market, and build a better world for all of us. Let me conclude by saying that WIPO stands ready to continue to work with WTO, all of US member states, and all the stakeholders out there to make this happen, and to once again congratulate the WTO on this 30th anniversary of the TRIPS agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director General. May I now invite Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, to open the event.
Well, thank you, Wolf, and let me thank Darren for joining us today. Many of you may not know, but Darren is really a trade negotiator. That's what he spent most of his career doing. So you're welcome home. You will feel comfortable. I also want to thank the TRIPS Council and Wolf and the Secretariat, Tony, everybody, Joanna, for putting today together. I'm delighted to welcome, I see so many of our ambassadors here today, and to welcome you all to mark the 30 years since the TRIPS agreement was concluded in Marrakesh as part of the historic package of multilateral agreements that brought the WTO into existence in its current form. I'm delighted that, Darren, that you could join us just a day before WIPO itself celebrates World Intellectual Property Day under the theme IP and the SDGs. You've always insisted, and I'm off script now, that IP must be related to development and must deliver for small and medium enterprises and deliver for developing countries. From the first day I met you. So I'm not surprised to see you focusing on IP and the SDGs. I just want to thank you and your staff for what you do. My colleagues tell me that when WTO was created, the inclusion of intellectual property in its mandate caused some unease in WIPO and in IP circles generally. Would the WTO and its TRIPS agreement effectively be in competition with WIPO and its legal and policy instruments that date back to your precursor over a century? Might the new WTO even create a competing stream of international IP law? I think we can safely say that such concerns have been put to rest. In practice, we've seen collegiality and positive sum win-win collaboration between our two organizations. Certainly, that has been my personal experience, as I said, from the first time I met you, it's been fun working with you and Tedros together. And what we were able to do during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's an example of the way that organizations can work to try and deliver for their members. Indeed, the TRIPS agreement sets out positive sum objectives for the IP system itself. It articulates the compelling idea that the IP system exists to promote the mutual interests of both producers and users of technological knowledge in a way that promotes social and economic welfare and that balances rights with obligations. This idea resonates today as we consider the potential contribution of the IP system to the economic, environmental, and social equity objectives set out in the SDGs. The idea of balance was vitally important during the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 1990s, when access to antiretroviral treatments was literally the difference between life and death for millions of people, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Ill-informed and poorly grounded opposition to developing countries' entirely legitimate actions to leverage access to affordable medicines did much to situate TRIPS within wider debates on public health. Developing countries brought the issue to the WTO, leading to the conclusion in 2001 of the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health. The declaration clearly reaffirmed the use of TRIPS flexibilities to protect public health and promote access to medicines for all. It clarified that flexibilities were a core element of the TRIPS agreement from the outset and confirmed that governments could legitimately use compulsory licensing and other policies within the TRIPS framework to enable the mass production and distribution of generic HIV/AIDS drugs in poor countries, which helped drive down costs and ultimately save millions of lives. This background of political unease over TRIPS also meant that on its conclusion 30 years ago, developing countries mostly saw the agreement as a negotiating concession, a trade-off for benefits elsewhere, not as a positive interest, nor as a practical tool for development. They were apprehensive about being hit with litigation and even trade sanctions as they wrestled with the challenges of implementing their new obligations under TRIPS. Some trade economists questioned the logic of trade rules reaching behind the border to impose obligations to protect IP. Civil society groups feared the agreement would have a range of negative social, economic, and even environmental impacts and would largely benefit certain vested interests. The experience since then has eased many of these concerns. Developing countries have taken ownership of TRIPS and applied it increasingly in ways that respond to their domestic needs and circumstances. We have a greater understanding of how IP rights facilitate technology transfer, participation in international production chains, and knowledge spillovers for the benefit of developing countries. Yet, even today, the TRIPS agreement is not immune from controversy. Witness the difficult negotiations here over the linkage between TRIPS and the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, a debate charged with deep concern about global inequities in access to life-saving supplies, especially vaccines, in which political exchanges were part and parcel of complex technical and logistical issues. One clear lesson from this debate was the need to support developing countries in mapping out and effectively implementing their legitimate options under the TRIPS agreement, work that we are committed to as essential preparation for future pandemics. We must foster continued discussion about how TRIPS fits into the wider trade policy and development landscape, and how it would best be implemented by a diverse membership so as to promote the goals of social and economic welfare that the agreement itself refers to. Today, we understand even more clearly than we did 30 years ago the centrality of technological knowledge and new technologies for economic growth and sustainable development. And we know that to address many of the biggest challenges we face, such as public health and climate change, the innovation and creative energies we urgently require must go hand in hand with far-reaching diffusion and equitable access if they are to serve the developmental and social needs of our communities. And this vital debate requires continuing review and recalibration of national policy settings, IP law and policy, and thus the implementation of TRIPS are intertwined in the technological and economic transformations since 1994. That is why I see today's event and the future conversations I hope it informs as so valuable. We can look back on the practical experience of TRIPS implementation across the WTO's membership for insights into how members can adapt and apply the general principles of TRIPS in ways that best approach that optimal balancing of rights and obligations that the agreement calls for. I encourage you to make the lessons of the past, even the painful ones, a foundation for future collaboration and cooperation. A politicized partisan debate is unlikely to yield the insights of the enabling environment for policymakers to implement the best choices, best tailored for their national needs and priorities. Policymakers and the people they serve would almost certainly be better served by a careful, systematic, and inclusive conversation about the range of options open to adapt and apply TRIPS principles to diverse and changing circumstances. Here at the Secretariat, thanks to the transparency and review provisions in the agreement, we have at hand a rich stock of facts and figures that illustrate how TRIPS implementation has evolved over the years, shedding light on major policy issues and recent developments. We still have considerable scope to improve. We saw this at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and debate over the proposed TRIPS waiver, when many WTO members felt considerable uncertainty and even apprehension about the full range of legitimate options open to them under the TRIPS agreement, especially in the context of such a national and international crisis. The decision on the TRIPS agreement reached by consensus at the 12th Ministerial Conference was another step in the right direction. It clarified these options with respect to some of the most immediate concerns voiced by members in relation to access to vaccines. Like the Doha Declaration 2 decades earlier, the MC12 decision was a reminder of the value, indeed the necessity, of greater clarity and understanding about the options that members have open to them. Excellencies, let me conclude by saying that we see the WTO's 30th anniversary not as a one-day, one-off event, but rather as a process of forward-looking dialogue on how this organization can best respond to members' current and future needs and interests. I encourage you to engage in today's dialogue with a view to informing a positive forward agenda for the international IP system, one that strengthens its linkages with the innovation ecosystem, the creative industries, and the diffusion and uptake of technologies that will be critical for sustainable development. WIPO will continue to play a central role in the multilateral system as we work together to realize the social and economic benefits and the development potential of the intellectual property system. I thank you all for joining us today, and I want to wish you the very best for an engaging and inspiring set of conversations. And now I hand over to Wolf and to Joanna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General. Thank you to both Director Generals for taking the time, and if I may say so, for demonstrating the rapport that exists so visibly between those organizations. This would be a moment to, if you have to leave the podium, and then I would, but maybe we can give them a round of applause before they depart. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This allows me to move to the next point of the agenda, which is the keynote speech. May I introduce the Deputy Director General, Johanna Hill, who is the most recent addition to the Director Generals in the WTO and who has responsibility, amongst other things, for the TRIPS area and intellectual property, government procurement, and competition. DDG Hill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wolf. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us for today's dialogue. I am particularly grateful for the support and engagement of Director General Okonjo-Iweala and her counterpart, Director General Tang. Their presence underscores not only the importance of this occasion, but also the high value that both organizations place on the excellent collegiate program of cooperation that has developed and expanded over the years, very much to the benefit of members. We have much to reflect on as the WTO marks its 30th anniversary. And just think of the 3 words that constitute our name, World Trade Organization. Each word now evokes a very different reality from that of 30 years ago. Let's start with the word world. Our world today differs politically, economically, socially, and technologically from the world that we saw when the agreement was established in 1994. Trade. Trade has also been radically transformed, not only in the makeup, scale, and direction of conventional trade, but also with the introduction of totally new forms of international transactions, fueled by radical technological change. And third, organization. This organization differs in fundamental ways from the fledgling institution that was coming into existence 3 decades ago on the foundations created by the GATT. So what was a path-breaking agreement on intellectual property 30 years ago, the TRIPS agreement, exemplifies each of these 3 transformations. And I'd like to explore these developments in my remarks today. First, coming back to world. The world of intellectual property is profoundly transformed from the situation that prevailed at the time of the TRIPS agreement or when it was coming into force. Participation in and benefits from the IP system are increasingly widespread and more equitable. Second, trade. The TRIPS agreement refers to trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. The so-called aspects, the forms of interaction between trade and IP, have greatly evolved and diversified since the ink dried on the newly concluded treaty in 1994. And today we see, for instance, extensive international trade and IP rights as traded items in themselves, amounting to billions of such transactions annually. And third, the organization. This is an organization with more than double its original membership, and a membership that is even more diverse and more representative of the global community. The expansion of membership over the years has brought into the WTO major new and dynamic IP jurisdictions, corresponding with the diversification of innovative and creative activity across the globe. In reviewing the landscape, I'd like to share with you three broad themes, ideas that I hope will stimulate further discussion about the way ahead for TRIPS and its future relevance to the full range of our members' policy interests and development aspirations. The first is the transition we have experienced from an early polarized north-south view of TRIPS to the more multipolar, inclusive, and nuanced view that prevails today. The second theme is the maturing of the concept of what it means to implement TRIPS. Instead of just a direct legal compliance with treaty obligations, to an understanding that the shared general principles of TRIPS can serve as a platform for informed, nuanced policy and legal development tailored to the needs and priorities of each country. And the third theme is a transformation in the way IP is traded and the exciting, if challenging, opportunities this opens up for the knowledge-driven, sustainable development. So let me take up the first theme. We have experienced a fundamental transition in the perception of the TRIPS agreement. As I mentioned, from a binary view of TRIPS as essentially a deal contrived to serve the interest of a handful of major developed countries, to a multipolar view that situates developing countries at their rightful place at the table, meaning as active players in the knowledge economy. If you look at the literature and even the diplomatic discourse from the time the TRIPS agreement was concluded, a persistent theme that we hear is the assumption of a sharp north-south dichotomy in perceived interests. The proceedings at the Marrakesh Conference in 1994 include references to the TRIPS agreement as a major concession on the part of developing countries. And the conference heard calls for technical cooperation rather than legal harassment, as one participant put it. And today we can see the TRIPS agreement maturing into a balanced, inclusive multilateral platform for the contemporary knowledge economy. It is a foundation for positive-sum cooperation between diverse partners. This perspective can be attributed in part to the enormous efforts and investment resources that many developing countries applied in building their IP systems. In many jurisdictions, TRIPS triggered a truly unprecedented program of legislative overhaul, institution building, and human capital development in the IP field. TRIPS transparency materials enable us to follow this remarkable record of achievements by many of our members. So instead of the feared deluge of dispute settlement litigation, we saw a strong track record of practical implementation. The very emphasis that was called for in Marrakesh on cooperation and not litigation against developing countries. And we saw national IP systems develop in ways that were increasingly tailored to members' domestic needs and circumstances. We saw a wide range of technical cooperation and collaboration with an increased focus in the development dimension and the interaction of the IP system with the wider policy domains such as health and the environment. So more generally, we have seen developing countries taking ownership of the agreement and exerting effective agency in defining and asserting their interests. The sole amendment to the TRIPS agreement thus far, and indeed the first amendment to the whole WTO package, was an African group initiative. It was a proposal to revise the agreement in the interest of access to affordable medicines for the most vulnerable. Developing country members initiated and advocated other major proposals for the revision of TRIPS. An example is the long-standing proposal to revise patent standards to take into account of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. The baton was passed to WIPO, which is taking up this issue at a historic diplomatic conference next month. And in contrast to assumptions that developing countries would largely be on the receiving end of TRIPS disputes, they have actively asserted their interest through the inclusion of TRIPS in the WTO dispute settlement system. And since 2000, when the bulk of TRIPS obligations kicked in for developing countries, most TRIPS disputes have been filed by developing country complaints. And 3 developing countries have sought to use cross-retaliation under TRIPS to leverage access to agricultural markets and online services trade. But perhaps the most striking development in our view has been the global trends in the actual usage of the intellectual property system. WIPO statistics show that over 2/3 of global patent filings in 2022 were in Asia, compared to 10% in Europe and 18% in North America. When it comes to trademark filings, predominantly developing country regions accounted for more than 3/4 of global activity in the year 2022. Of course, we should not naively read too much into the raw statistics, but there's no denying the remarkable shift southwards and eastwards in the center of gravity of global IP activity as developing countries and their innovators, their creators, and their enterprises take up the tools laid out in the TRIPS agreement. The second theme I would like to cover is the more nuanced and policy-rich understanding of what it means to actually implement the TRIPS agreement. An early conception of TRIPS implementation focused on elements that were really necessary to ensure that domestic law and administration complied with the obligations in the agreement. And for most developing countries, the desire probably to avoid dispute settlement was an important impulse behind TRIPS implementation. And while this motive drove forward some key legislation in the early years of TRIPS implementation, this is clearly not the ideal frame of mind in which to formulate and put into place the principal legal infrastructure for the knowledge economy and knowledge-driven development. So today, we can make a more expansive and progressive view of what it means to implement TRIPS. It's time to reconceive it as a process of assessing domestic needs against policy options and applying the agreement's general principles in a multitude of ways that adapt to and respond to individual members' needs and priorities. Thus, the implementation of TRIPS increasingly entails exploring ample policy space that negotiators consciously built into the treaty text. Furthermore, this approach sets up possibilities for members to learn from the diversity of each other's approaches. More than 5,000 legislative texts have been shared amongst members through the use of the TRIPS agreement's powerful transparency mechanism. Therefore, today, the question for those seeking to implement TRIPS is focused on practical and policy lessons one can learn from the experience of similar jurisdictions. Beyond the TRIPS Council, the Trade Policy Review has developed as a valuable source of insight into how our diverse membership has taken up the challenges of adapting the IP system to the contemporary knowledge economy. IP has been a feature of over 500 trade policy reviews conducted since the year 1995, covering 157 members. The overall trend is a rise in the Q&A concerning IP policy settings during the TPRs, with developing country members becoming increasingly engaged. Members have probed many aspects of IP settings, including their link to growth in export strategies, climate change mitigation and adaptation technologies, creative industries, and gender equality, as well as the evolution towards the digital economy. And the third theme I'd leave you with relates to the technological revolution we have been living through. For TRIPS negotiators 30 years back, probably the main linkages between IP and trade was the value that IP added to certain traded goods. At the time, IP rights, for the most part, were not considered tradable goods in their own right. And tellingly, the roots of the TRIPS negotiations lay in earlier proposals in the GATT to crack down on trade in counterfeit goods, for example. However, as the TRIPS negotiations progressed, their work in this building, elsewhere in Switzerland at CERN, Tim Berners-Lee was busy inventing the World Wide Web. And it was very shortly after the conclusion of the TRIPS agreement that the full potential impact of the internet was coming into focus. The web began to emerge as a vital conduit for sharing knowledge, cultural works, educational material, and intangible goods. Today, thanks to the sustained transformative effects of digital technology, we have seen trade in IP rights as such become a significant component of international trade. This phenomenon has two important implications for future trade and development policy. First, IP transactions form some of the critical links in global value chains. They are the conduit for the transmission of new technologies, leading to accelerated knowledge spillovers, as WTO research has demonstrated. Second, global platforms for trading in creative works and other digital cargoes are in themselves thriving marketplaces for IP licenses. Countless billions of IP transactions are concluded every year on these platforms, with benefits flowing ultimately to creators and developers situated around the world. We can say countless quite literally because much of this activity is not captured by our current trade statistics. And this poses a challenge for assessing how such trade in IP can benefit developing countries. Moreover, there are concerns that existing digital content platforms are highly concentrated and may not meet the needs of creators and developers in all regions. However, as our Trade and Knowledge project aims to demonstrate, there is remarkable opportunity for seizing the potential new ways of trading in IP rights to provide sustainable futures for creators in all regions around the world. And while developing countries overall are participating more and more effectively in IP systems, the original proponents of the TRIPS agreement are still major beneficiaries. Thus, the trade statistics do show that despite the rising share on the part of some more technologically advanced developing countries, developing country members continue to enjoy the benefits of a robust use of IP systems. When it comes to reported IP licensees, for example, the US, Germany, and Japan were the leading exporters, accounting for 29, 11, and 11% respectively of the total value of over $440 billion reported by WTO members in the year 2022. So beyond spanning the North-South divide, there are other aspects of global inclusion and equity that do remain challenging for the IP system. Recent WIPO analysis on the innovation gender gap found that women inventors are involved in only 23% of all patent applications and represent 13% of all inventors. The rate of participation is growing, but hardly at an impressive rate, and on current trends, we would reach parity in the year 2060. Members in the TRIPS Council have helpfully reviewed the gender dimension of innovation, but continuing action is plainly needed so that societies benefit from the full innovative capacity of all their populations. Another aspect of inclusion is a dynamic MSME sector, which includes some significant players in the innovation ecosystem and is also a key area of inclusion. Overall, industry studies have shown that MSMEs make most use of the IP system are the ones more likely to grow and contribute to the economy. A Japanese study found that MSMEs with patent portfolios had 77% higher income per employee and a higher level of profit. Similar findings applied to industrial designs. Again, the TRIPS Council has had insightful discussions of MSME innovation policy, but ultimately it's up to governments to work together to reap the benefits of the IP system more widely. 30 years ago, when the TRIPS agreement was concluded, it set an ambitious objective for the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. As you've heard in the preceding interventions, as Article 7 puts it, the goal was to, quote, contribute to the promotion of technological innovation and to the transfer and dissemination of technology to the mutual advantage of users and producers of technological knowledge and in a manner conducive to social and economic welfare and to a balance of rights and obligations, end quote. How to continue delivering and increase delivering on this promise in actual practice is a challenge today in a radically transformed technological, economic, and geopolitical environment, even if the bedrock principles of a balanced and effective IP system remain the same. I believe we have a common responsibility and an exciting opportunity to reflect on the practical lessons from the TRIPS implementation over the past 3 decades. I think we ought to apply these lessons in a positive, collaborative way to bring about the social and economic welfare that TRIPS calls for. The Secretariat team stands ready to support these efforts, just as it has steadfastly done for the past 3 decades. Its unwavering dedication and service to membership over this time is a reason for pride and appreciation. I'm sure everyone is looking forward to the insights from our eminent panelists in our program today. Let's make sure our dialogue contributes to a forward-looking, constructive set of conversations that can chart the way for TRIPS to deliver on its promise in today's challenging environment. I thank you for your kind attention and your commitment to a vital dialogue.
Thank you very much, Deputy Director General, for this comprehensive scene setting, which I think gets us on the way to the rest of our program. Thank you so much. We are now moving to a Secretariat overview of 30 years of the TRIPS agreement before we move to the panels that we have prepared. I'm handing over to the Director of the Intellectual Property Government Procurement and Competition Division, Anthony Taubman, who will provide this overview after a short video that should be shown now. I think headsets might be useful for this. Thank you very much. And I think we are underway. For Tony, just to share your screen, I think. Anthony Taubman.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a real privilege for me to be able to join you after that high-level introduction. And I'd like to really greet very, very warmly not only our delegates, partners from other organizations, but some truly venerable figures in the field of international intellectual property who you'll be meeting very, very shortly. I have limited time, but I could not resist recognizing the wonderful people who are in this room with us. So my job is to add a little bit of background to the picture that we've heard from our leaders just now, and really to identify and illustrate some of the practical ways that we can learn from those hard lessons of the 30 years of TRIPS implementation. If we do take stock of developments over the past 30 years, perhaps the most important substantial consideration is that for most members by now, the initial phase of implementing the TRIPS agreement is well and truly over. In the early years of TRIPS, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there were enormous efforts to extend and update intellectual property systems. This was especially clear in the developing world, where very significant resources were devoted in the process of implementing the TRIPS agreement. And this was not merely about passing legislation, although there were unprecedented levels of legislative development. It involved the development of new or expanded institutions, administrations, reaching through to the courts and customs officials, for example. In some cases, literally building new institutions from the ground up, and immense amounts of human capital development. This remarkable achievement, and by the way, WIPO was a major, as we've heard, a major partner in that, this is now essentially taken for granted, but we should reflect on the significance of that development. It was a massive transformation for many countries, and certainly where the greatest impact of TRIPS implementation is felt even today. We do have clear evidence of this effort. This is taken from the eTRIPS platform. The remarkable collection of, indeed, the rate is rising all the more. We have now over 6,000 notifications of laws and regulations implementing the TRIPS agreement. There are several peaks in this trend from 1995 through to the present day, and I'll touch on those shortly. But this is in itself an enormous source of information. In reflecting on how best to learn from and apply the lessons of these 3 decades of practical experience, I'd suggest one organizing concept that we can consider is the idea of TRIPS as a platform. Now, there's no clear definition of what a platform is, but we do hear a lot of discussion in TRIPS and IP policy circles about the significance of platforms, both especially in the technological area. And this is one definition that I particularly liked, the idea it's a structure which can be inclusive, drive information, foster business growth, but very diverse in character. And we do see this as one way of mapping the absolutely transformed global economy that we see today. Indeed, it extends to one of the most important technological developments we've been looking at for the last 4 years, and that is mRNA as a platform for drug development, one that was indeed worthy of a Nobel Prize. What does this mean for TRIPS as a platform for policymakers in the knowledge economy? There's various ideas of a platform in this sense, and I don't mean to belabor the concept, but we have this notion of an enabling, inclusive mechanism that provides a way of working together to work within a set of agreed principles and to achieve collective outcomes. So we can consider the TRIPS agreement as a set of principles, a basis on which to build the knowledge economy. Early on, it was misunderstood, I think, as in effect a model law. And I think there was some purely reactive legislation that involved more or less cutting and pasting text from the TRIPS agreement into domestic law. And this was clearly not an optimal way of adapting and applying the principles in a way that really work for diverse economies, diverse national circumstances. So what we've moved to is this much broader picture of indeed some at latest count, and it's going up every day, 6,189 laws and legal texts have been notified by members, each of these representing a distinct, tailored way of responding to the principles, giving effect to the principles that the TRIPS agreement lays out as a kind of normative platform. If we look at that central article in the TRIPS agreement, the first time, by the way, that we ever heard in international intellectual property law, why do we have an intellectual property system? I guess it may have been taken for granted. The TRIPS agreement, for the first time in multilateral law, laid it out very clearly. And to oversimplify, I suggest that those 6,189 legislative notifications that have been evolving over the last 30 years, that more and more we see them as updates, revisions, reapplications of these principles. These are 6,189 ways of responding to that should that the TRIPS agreement sets as an objective for the intellectual property system. Indeed, this is what we hear more and more from our members when we discuss in a practical sense technical assistance. The discussion is much less about what do we need to do to comply, what do we need to do to follow the rules, much more about, well, can we hear about what others have been doing? Other like-minded nations, countries with similar legal traditions, economic standpoint, what have they been doing? Because that's actually more instructive, more enabling, and in my personal view, at least, actually a more effective way of thinking about and applying the principles of TRIPS, rather than seeing it as simply a matter of reactive legal compliance. So I'd like to suggest that these notifications are a practical policy resource, an valuable source of information for policymakers today. In the past, it's true that they were very difficult to consult and make use of. They were locked away almost literally in unreadable documents. That's no longer the case, thanks to the development of another platform, the e-TRIPS platform, which we certainly want to see taken up as a platform for policymakers today. In addition, TRIPS negotiators recognized that there were several distinct areas where there were both dynamic, but also areas where policy outlooks were quite diverse, where sometimes it was difficult to bridge understanding, sometimes even at the level of some essential principles. And these are the built-in reviews, consciously built in by the negotiators of the TRIPS agreement to provide for focused discussion, analysis of these issues. And the TRIPS Council has taken up these review processes. I have to say that the recent work has not been dynamic, and the rate of responses to the transparency mechanism set up to promote those reviews has tailed off very significantly. But these remain highly important and significant areas for policy discussion, and each WTO member is thinking about how to deal with these matters, how to protect geographical indications in a way that promotes the objectives of communities, of policymakers. What to do about the intersection between biotechnology, genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and the patent system. Indeed, we see that dynamism has moved up the hill to WIPO, or the diplomatic conference there. But there's every scope for an informed, grounded, illuminating discussion, making use of the tools that were built into the TRIPS agreement for this very purpose. The same applies to enforcement, a critical area where a lot of the balance that we talk about in abstract terms in the intellectual property system, enforcement is a very significant aspect of ensuring that the intellectual property system does what we hope for it to do, while at the same time not being overprotected or intrusive. The TRIPS agreement includes the principle that there should not be barriers to legitimate trade, and that is an important practical factor in enforcement. Once again, we had a good early start with a checklist on enforcement, which is a unique, invaluable platform in itself for understanding how members have gone about the task of enforcing intellectual property rights. But once again, as we see graphically here, it has tailed off considerably. To borrow a term from the platform economy, we do have potential network effects here. The more these transparency tools are used, the more useful they become for all. The more members who notify and update and report on within these frameworks, the more useful this platform is for all members. And I would say very frankly that that members have over the years put enormous resources into developing these platforms, both in preparing the materials that they provide to us and in maintaining these systems internationally. And I stress this is a matter of practical utility. This is so much what is drawn on if we are looking for practical ideas for policymakers to pursue at the domestic level and in important policy debates. You can delve into this material for all sorts of issues. What is the current approach to protecting unconventional trademarks? What copyright amendments have been undertaken to deal with the digital environment? What's the actual procedures for using flexibilities, the issues touched on earlier today? How is compensation determined in such cases? What are the agencies involved in intellectual property enforcement? These are questions that we receive frequently, and what we do is to turn to the actual practice of members that as a far more grounded and frankly compelling instance of where to find the answers than in a more abstract or purely treaty-based approach. We've heard important things about the trade policy review process, and I think this can't be stressed enough. Quite frankly, in the TRIPS Council Secretariat, we're quite jealous indeed of our colleagues in the trade policy review mechanism, because the discussions in that process concerning intellectual property matters are extraordinary. A very important discussions about how members are responding to contemporary development and policy challenges today, adapting and applying the main elements of the TRIPS agreement, of the intellectual property system. This is a very rough snapshot of the over 100 themes concerning intellectual property that members have asked of each other in these trade policy reviews. In other words, a dialogue between members, I say a respectful, informative, illuminating dialogue between our members concerning the current situation of intellectual property law and policy in each other. Once again, this is an extraordinary resource that policymakers, I suggest, do need to draw on and use much more actively. And again, once again, Technological Solutions, another platform, is coming to the rescue to make this material, which can be frankly hard to use sometimes, to make it more accessible. But it's once again, members have put enormous resources into developing this material. It is unique, it is inclusive, it corresponds both to the reports on the record that members themselves provide, and this very far-reaching peer-review discussion in the trade policy reviews. It's really tremendous material. The TRIPS agreement has been a platform also when we turn to bilateral and regional trade agreements. One of the really striking phenomena since 1994, but in particular since the year 2000, has been the number of bilateral and regional trade agreements that consciously, expressly build on the TRIPS agreement. Prior to the TRIPS agreement, it is very rare to see intellectual property provisions in a bilateral or regional trade agreement. The TRIPS agreement, in a sense, broke that mold, and it's very rare now to see a bilateral or regional trade agreement without intellectual property provisions. And indeed, it is very common in those agreements for them to have a provision reapplying or reaffirming TRIPS obligations, and then we have seen a trend of building on those obligations. Once again, not everyone agrees that this is the ideal way of progressing international intellectual property law, but it has happened, and it is an important part of the trade policy mix of the current international environment that we do need to understand more deeply and learn the lessons from. Finally, turning to actual trade in intellectual property as such, I won't dwell on this, just to say that we have prepared a 498-page book exploring these issues, trade in knowledge. So this is now purely an infomercial for that publication. The two main themes that are that firstly, trade in intellectual property is now a reality. It is not something that is purely embedded in physical products. We do now trade in licenses in intellectual property to the tune of many billions a year. And there are very important development considerations for this. Firstly, when it comes to understanding the development impact and implications of global value chains. And here there's very important statistical work still to be done. And secondly, if we look at the challenges and the opportunities of what we might call the app economy, the way that these platforms can be used. Statistics here are inadequate, frankly, and there are other wider challenges in front of us, but there's absolutely no doubt that such digital platforms do offer a potential way forward for more inclusive global trade for creators and innovators across the globe. Intellectual property, IP, corresponds with another platform, another IP, the Internet Protocol. The Internet Protocol is a set of rules. The Internet Protocol is a very simple set of rules in a way, but it has enormous diverse applications, and it has powered tremendous economic transformation. It has powered remarkable forms of inclusion that were frankly unthinkable over 30 years ago. Whether IP, the other IP, intellectual property, and the TRIPS agreement can achieve the same outcomes is, in a sense, up to the policymakers. But I do hope that the tools, the resources, the materials that we have available can be used in a practical way to advance those ends. Finally, next Monday and Tuesday, we have a much more low-key, much more granular, much more geeky, I would say, symposium, where we dig into these ideas in more detail. And so for anyone who finds this attractive, we would be delighted if you could join us then. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for this overview of significant data around the TRIPS agreement. I would now invite the first panel to join us and take over this high table, inviting Ambassador Pitfield, the chair of the Council for TRIPS, who will be the moderator of this panel, and the assorted panelists who participate in the first panels.
I'm okay. Good. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies and colleagues and friends. I will speak a little bit louder, so I ensure that nobody will be sleepy during our panel. Okay, because we are 5 minutes a bit late now, and I have been told again that this panel we will finish at 5 because we also have many distinguished speakers who will come in the second panel, and I'm looking forward to listening to them as well. The first panel titled is called TRIPS Implementation and Policy Then and Now. And my name is Pimchanok Pitfield. I'm the ambassador and permanent representative of Thailand to WTO and WIPO. And I'm the current chair of the TRIPS Council until tomorrow. Tomorrow is my last day. Phew! Yeah, okay. So I have the honor to moderating this first panel of the high-level dialogue this afternoon. The biographies of our distinguished speakers in this first panel are available on the website, so I will not go to that, just briefly introduce them and their title. We are very fortunate to have many distinguished ambassadors, and of course, our colleagues, the DPR from South Africa is also a very seasoned TRIPS negotiator. So we are certainly going to hear very interesting things. The first speaker on my right is Ms. Maria Matangpat. Do I pronounce correctly? Deputy Director General of the DG Trade of the European Commission in Brussels. Yeah, on my far left, but she's always red. Red is her favorite color. Is Her Excellency Miss Maria Pagan, Ambassador and Deputy United States Trade Representative of the USA. So on my right is His Excellency Mr. Guilherme Patriota, Ambassador and PR of Brazil, who has been there even before at the Uruguay round. Not even Marrakesh. He was before Marrakesh. So we're certainly going to listen to him a lot. And last but not least, we have our colleagues, long-time TRIPS negotiator, Mr. Marumo Nkomo, economic counselor and DPR of South Africa mission. I think there's some introduction on my side, but I will skip that. What I would like to do now is just to set out the rules for speakers and for us. For this panel, we have sent out 3 questions to the speakers. The first one will be about sharing experience of how they implement TRIPS agreement after the conclusion of the agreement in the domestic laws, and what lesson have they learned. The second question is about how they see the work of the TRIPS Council. And the last one is how do you see the way forward? Given the importance of the first issue and something that we don't hear very regularly, I would suggest that we spend at least half an hour or half hour session on the first question, and therefore each will be given about 6 minutes each for the first questions. And the second and third questions. Second question, I think maybe we can spend less time because we talk about day-to-day work of the Council for TRIPS. But if they have a lot of views, fine, but maybe we spend less time on that. And we also would like to hear a little bit more on how they see the way forward for TRIPS agreement and work of IP in the WTO. And I would like to, if possible, leave some time for questions or participation from the floor. And therefore, without further ado, I will ask the first questions, which is what has been their experience with implementing the TRIPS agreement in domestic IP systems, and how has TRIPS impacted trade policy and its linkages with other areas of policy since its inception in 1994? I will start with maybe DDG Maria, and maybe we can start also with on the right side, and then we come to the left side for the first question. So yeah, you have about 6 minutes. Our time you've got in the WTO we only have 3 minutes now. So okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here. I was not at the Uruguay round, but I was around at the time the TRIPS agreement became part of the IP landscape. And I do remember the angst at the time in WIPO as to what will happen and where was power shifting is just a mere 30 years ago. Now, the reply I will give to your first question is a bit specific because I am here representing the European Union. So is a multitude of domestic realities. And in that regard, the impact that the TRIPS agreement has had, the implementation of the TRIPS agreement in the European Union, the effect is particularly important. IP is a fundamental element in trade, is equally or even more when you're trying to build an internal market, i.e. an area where you do have to ensure the free movement, among other things, of goods and services. So we, along the years, it took us more than 30 years and it's still work underway. But the building of a European internal market has also been based first in the conventions that were negotiated and agreed in WIPO and then in the TRIPS agreement. We have in our implementation aimed at a higher level of harmonization, not because this been a request of the agreement, but because of our own domestic needs. And the results of that implementation is extremely positive for us. We do have regular studies that in a very consistent manner show that what we call IPR intensive industries, i.e. those that are above average, backed by patents, trademarks, designs, copyright, and otherwise, contribute to the EU GDP at about 47% of its annual GDP. A figure close to 40% of our jobs owe their existence to IP intensive sectors. And if we move on as to the effects of implementation of the TRIPS agreement on trade, our IPR intensive industries do play a very central role in our trade. They account for 80.5% of our imports, but also they play a very important role in the trade of other countries because they amount to 80.1% of 80.5 of our imports and 80.1 of our exports. So we are exporting high IP goods and services. We are importing in almost the same manner. Now, this does not take away a point that has been made consistently in the last discussions. The TRIPS agreement remains an instrument that brings a minimum common standards on IP, and that does provide for a very important element of flexibility and possibilities, power to their members to shape and adapt their national IP system to their needs. Each member has a unique context and has a possibility to balance the IP protection with the social and economic realities that it has within the framework that has been provided by the TRIPS agreement that maybe at the beginning of its implementation was not sufficiently understood, but I think this is something that is very, very obvious now. So those inbuilt TRIPS flexibilities that have shown quite an important resilience, and I think it's very healthy that they keep being considered and that members continue to assess and adapt the legislation. By the way, we do the same. But that is part of, if you want, the legacy of the agreement and how it has helped us in terms of our current implementation and in terms of fostering trade. I've not been checking your timing.
You still have 1.5 minutes.
Fantastic.
At least, go ahead.
But that is very, very important for us. In that respect, going forward, from our point of view, and again, it's not a novel idea, it's been discussed, IP as a component of trade is increasing in importance. Trading services is increasing in importance. Trading technology is increasing in importance, and in turn, technology is vital to address some of the biggest challenges we have in our times, and there the green transition is a particular important one, and trade in the type of technologies, trade that helps the investment for that transition is a reality that needs to be underpinned by the trade, by the TRIPS agreement. In our view, going forward, we will continue to adapt our legislation as we see is needed, and ensure that it continues to sustain what is basically an economy that depends very much on IP for its development and innovation. We do understand that realities vary in the world. We do believe that it's very, very important to continue to expand our discussions on the implementation of the TRIPS agreement, and to expand as well something that was being referred to before as well, the best practices and exchange of knowledge and collaboration in terms of the ideas that have been put on the ground to implement the agreement. Before you stop me, I stop, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, thanks for the perspective from the EU. Now, let's listen to South Africa, your domestic experience and the linkage with other policy areas. Thank you. Marumo, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Ambassador. First, I'd like to thank the organizers, in particular the IP division, ably led by Director Taubman, Wolf, and other colleagues. It's really an honor to participate in a panel marking such an auspicious occasion, 30 years of the TRIPS agreement. Some of you may know that it actually coincides with a very significant anniversary back in my home country. On Saturday, we'll celebrate 30 years since the end of apartheid and the inauguration of President Nelson Mandela as our first democratically elected president, what we call Freedom Day. In 1998, President Mandela addressed the WTO on the 15th anniversary of the GATT. He highlighted that South Africa is fully committed to a rules-based multilateral trading system. He warned of the systemic risks if rules fail to benefit many and are concentrated, the benefits are concentrated among a few. And he called upon the most powerful economies to refrain from applying unilateral measures. I will use these themes to assess South Africa's experience in implementing the TRIPS agreement. Now, very soon after his address, less than 2 years after his address, President Mandela was cited as a defendant in a lawsuit by an amalgamation of multinational pharmaceutical producers, alleging inter alia that a new law introduced to ensure affordable access to medicines and making use of parallel importation was in violation of the TRIPS agreement. Now, South Africa stood its ground, and those events it was one of the events that led up to the 2001 Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health, and I'm happy to see Professor Abbott among us. He was intimately involved in that particular case, and in fact, his 2001 article, Lighting a Dark Corner in the WTO, provides an excellent account, important account of those events. Now, despite the clarifications provided in the Doha Declaration, South Africa has continued to face inordinate pressure to refrain from using the same policy tools employed by many advanced economies. Since that time, we've seen that, for instance, these experiences of South Africa and other developing countries resulted in the 2016 United Nations Secretary General high-level report on access to medicines, recommending that governments and corporations must refrain from explicit or implicit threats, tactics, and strategies that undermine the use of TRIPS flexibilities. It is such concerns that have also resulted in the current proposal in the context of the INB to have a peace clause. So those concerns remain. Aside from constraints in using TRIPS flexibilities resulting from external pressures, there has been an inadequate accrual of benefits to local innovators from our perspective. For instance, our IP office conducted a study of the profile of patent applicants over a 10-year period. It found that only 10% of patents granted were by local applicants. So this, for me, certainly evokes the memory of Professor Abbott's 1989 article entitled "Protecting First World Assets in the Third World." For South Africa, we are keen to reflect on the experience of implementing the TRIPS agreement. And in doing so, it would be important to ensure that for us that barriers to legitimate use of TRIPS flexibilities in the form of external pressures are ameliorated. And we'd also like to see a more equitable distribution of the benefits that accrue from the TRIPS implementation. The first issue is one that would need to be taken up at the international level, while the latter is an important element of legislative reforms that we're currently undergoing in South Africa. And we've actually worked very closely with the trilateral forum of the WIPO, WHO, and the WTO in this context. And we are very grateful to these institutions for the cooperation that they've shown. And we're hopeful that with the help of these institutions and through learning from experiences of other members, we'd be able to fully ensure that the objectives stated in the TRIPS agreement are attained. Thank you.
Thank you very much, South Africa. Now I will turn to, perhaps I'll start with Maria from the US, sharing, and then we have Ambassador Guilherme.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And first of all, I thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this dialogue, which is very important. I would like to start by laying out three general themes as we reflect on the TRIPS agreement and consider how we move forward in our work here. First, we want to make sure that the WTO is and remains relevant to all people, to honor the Marrakesh Agreement's recognition that the purpose of our collective engagement here is with a view toward, among other things, raising standards of living and increasing real income and effective demand. And earlier, some of the speakers have also referred to the objectives laid out in the TRIPS agreement, which are similar to these ideas. In this regard, when it comes to TRIPS, we recognize the twin goals of promoting innovation and promoting access to technology. Second, we believe that sharing national experiences can provide valuable lessons learned, including successes and challenges. Third, we believe that the TRIPS Council is most productive when we focus on facts and specifics. There are many areas of shared or common interest among WTO members, and we believe we should be focusing our work on those areas. Now, turning to some experiences in the United States. As many of you know, and as was documented in the recent U.S. International Trade Commission report on the COVID-19 diagnostics, in the past, the United States would use a special 301 report to express disapproval of the WTO members for invoking the compulsory licensing flexibilities provided for in TRIPS. Under the Biden administration, we have stopped this practice. We recognize that flexibilities built into TRIPS were part of the TRIPS bargain itself and should be respected. Just this morning, I think at 5 a.m. in the morning in Washington, D.C. time, we released the 2024 Special 301 report, and we made note of this change in practice. In general, this administration has approached the report with an eye toward making sure that we're reflecting the points of view of many of our stakeholders, not just those who have the deepest pockets. This is part of an ongoing conversation in the United States and in many places to recognize the balance we need between incentivizing innovation, which we strongly believe in, and making that innovation available to our people. So this is just one way to fulfill the ideals reflected in the Marrakesh Agreement, and again, Article 7 of the TRIPS Agreement itself. Now, with respect to recognizing the value of innovation, I would like to refer to a TRIPS Council agenda item. Maybe this is getting a little geeky, but it's the item on IP and innovation, which is near and dear to our heart, because we believe it is a good example of how we can have very productive engagement at the TRIPS Council regarding implementation of the TRIPS Agreement in domestic systems and gain a better understanding of the impact of the TRIPS Agreement on other areas of policy, including trade policy. Over the past 10 years of this agenda item, the Friends, what are called the Friends of IP and Innovation group, has tried to really think through potential themes for each meeting so that all members are able to contribute and share their national experiences. And past topics have included inclusive innovation, IP and new businesses, and IP and sports. And we can learn important lessons from looking at how this agenda item came about. No surprise, in the past, maybe still today, members are consistently disagreeing on the same agenda items from meeting to meeting. And there was a need for a discussion in areas of commonalities relating to IP that would be an open tent for members to share national experiences. The first official intellectual property and innovation agenda item at the TRIPS Council was in November of 2012 and was added to the agenda by Brazil and the United States. And back then we said, the objective of the two delegations was to have an exchange of information and national innovation strategies and the role IP protection played in fostering innovation. And the hope was that by sharing national experiences, members might contribute to the mutual goal of providing stable and predictable environments to promote and benefit from innovation. And I'm not going to go through the long laundry list of items, but we have heard over the years from many, many members, Brazil, Chile, Turkey, Peru, Montenegro, India, and many others on many, many issues, including the importance of women and innovation to their economies, innovation hubs, national invention competitions. One example is from the Dominican Republic, their focus on boosting technological innovation and how that really made significant changes after only 2 years. So again, these items have held the TRIP Council focus on areas of collaboration and learning instead of areas of divisiveness. Of course, this does not mean that we're shying away from difficult conversations because those need to be had, but we must not lose sight of the fact that we are capable of engaging constructively, even in the TRIPS Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Maria. She has already answered the second question as well. So I don't know whether she will want extra in the last question or not, but now I give the floor to Ambassador Patriota from Brazil. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Pinchamok. And thanks to the organizers for celebrating this TRIPS at 30. I wonder why I was actually invited and selected to be here, because I've been listening to all these very celebratory and sort of rosy renditions of the TRIPS history, which is not necessarily my personal experience. And since I was in the Uruguay round, that's 1986 when it started, I think I should have a couple extra minutes to express my views, because I have a longer period to cover. I'm getting older as well, so it was noted. Okay, so just a little bit of the perception at the time. The TRIPS agreement produced a radical shift away from the previous system that was administered by WIPO. It was a brutal, in a way, process of upwards harmonization of IP laws throughout, before and covering all domains of intellectual property. As you know, WIPO is the administrator of several treaties. Each treaty is an independent legal entity over there. And in fact, WIPO pre-existed WIPO as a UN agency. It's one of the oldest organizations around here, because the treaties that were given to it exist since over 100 years. So 100 years of legal tradition was completely shaken by TRIPS in all fields. So the fields are patents, utility models, copyrights, trademarks, industrial designs, integrated circuits, geographical indications. At WIPO, there was much greater balance of obligations because, first of all, treaties existed in different versions. You could adhere to a treaty of a certain version. So, well, I want to be a part of this treaty, but up until the version of that particular year. And that version of that particular year was less committal. So you commit less, you can adjust and join treaties as they evolve according to your own national level of development, in particular in an area where developing countries really have not achieved significant development, which is the area of science and technology and innovation, one of the most complicated areas to achieve success for countries that are still dealing with basic issues of industrialization. And again, another impact, not only was there upwards harmonization of the law of the requirements, one obvious example is patent duration, which was established as a minimum standard, but it was a high minimum standard because we have the false impression when we say minimum that it's low, but it's a higher standard that became the minimum standard because in Brazil it was 15 years, the duration of a patent, but in the TRIPS agreement, the minimum standard was 20. So the 20 minimum standard was 5 years more than the existing standard in Brazil, just to mention my own country. So again, and then you go through the history. This was common discussions and conversations we had at the time. A lot of the countries that are today great defenders and sort of consumers of IP and protect the system avidly, such as Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, they became giants in the chemical and pharmaceutical sectors. They were latecomers into providing patents to products in these areas, in the chemical and pharmaceutical sectors. For example, only in the 70s, they started to do that. So they had their time to adjust, and they took on obligations at the rate of development of their their advanced industries. Developing countries had no real industries to speak of, but we took on much higher obligations with TRIPS and without any transition period to speak of. So this was a huge step towards harmonization, almost short of a global patent almost, because there was such stringent, the harmonization was not just on the substantive elements of the law of the protection, but also on administrative procedures. There's a lot of limitations. You had some of those before in the former treaties that existed with WIPO, but of course, everything changes when you transpose that into a treaty at the WTO because it becomes subjected to the dispute settlement system of this organization. Now a little bit awaiting new developments as well because it was cut short not too long ago by a particular member. But before we knew that would happen, we were very afraid of taking on all these commitments. And then if we wouldn't comply, we would be up for a dispute, and the dispute tied to retaliatory measures. So it was really serious stuff. This didn't happen before with the WIPO treaties. The consequences of not being able to comply with something were not so grave. So the effort also that developing countries took to adapt and comply with TRIPS was huge in terms of adapting administratively, in terms of resources needed, in terms of the legal requirements to comply. Even the judicial system had to be upgraded because it was not prepared to take on such complex suits and tasks. And again, there were other limitations of the system. You couldn't, for example, TRIPS would not allow you to have parallel imports, for example. So you couldn't import from a country a particular medicine that you may require for your public health system from a third country where that particular medicine was not protected by a patent. You couldn't do that because that was also blocked by the treaty. So it was a considerable strengthening of monopolies. That's what it was, especially for global corporations.
Give you 1 more minute. From
Yeah.
Ambassador Maria. Sorry.
Anyway, and TRIPS was, I will also say, a main driver for the Uruguay round. That was what kind of rallied huge political pressure for the round to conclude, because as you recall, that was the largest single undertaking that ever happened in this organization, including former GATT in terms of number of issues and ambition. And the TRIPS agreement was of such interest to such powerful corporations that they pressured their headquarters countries to try and rally everybody around the conclusion of the round. So that's why it's the last single undertaking. Today, everybody wants to run away from any kind of single undertaking. When I say, you know, I cannot commit to a certain thing because I've been waiting 25 years to get a mandate to negotiate further liberalization of agricultural products. I'm not talking about integrated circuits. I'm talking about soybeans and rice. And no, you can't link this with anything else. We want moratorium on e-commerce, no taxation on e-commerce, because our big tech wants to, you know, rule the world tax-free, duty-free. But we want to sell, you know, peanuts and bananas and whatever, also not duty-free and tax-free, but at least with tariffs lower than 300% and quotas that are a little bit bigger than what we currently have. So I'll have to stop here because I'm under a very restrictive mandate here of our chair. But I think you got the picture. It can go on for quite a while. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. So we have heard that nothing has been easy from any members who have spoken, even you know, US or EU. Okay, but let me move on to EU first, because I think some of the ambassadors have touched, even Marumo also talked about a way forward a little bit already. So maybe I will give the floor back to the EU to share perspective on how you see the work in the TRIPS Council, and maybe highlight a few more way forward in your views. Thank you. Some maybe 1-2 minutes. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I think, and in view of the diverse views that you see here, just when you have 3 countries and a group of countries speaking, 30 years after the adoption of the TRIPS agreement, the most important role that the TRIPS Council could play now and going forward, in my view, will be to try to get into a discussion that builds around what we, I hope, all believe, which is under the right circumstances and when needed, the right flexibilities, intellectual property is a needed element for the development, for the transfer of technology, and for innovation. And also, with all due respect to the importance of patents, that there are many other parts of intellectual property. And I refuse the statement that the protection of creators, for instance, which is what copyright does, is only for the benefit of the developed countries. Some of the best music you can listen to, some of the best writing you can read comes from countries where the level of development has absolutely nothing to do with the result of the creative activity of their people. And we can talk about design, and we can talk about trademarks, and we can talk about many other parts of the whole IP ecosystem. So in that respect, if we can get the TRIPS Council engaging on facts on the ground, having discussions to really monitor, evaluate, and help the members when needed, if required, with an effective implementation of the agreement in a manner that it does not only unleash the protection of the IP, but also allows the use of the inbuilt flexibilities. That's where we are today. That's what we agreed to 30 years ago. And if anything, the world has gone in a direction that shows us that technology and intellectual creation is the basis for our economy going forward. So in that respect, using the rules that we have given ourselves, thanks to as well, the possibility to use the flexibilities that have been built, is in my way the most judicious way to go forward. So if we could get into facts in our discussions, that would be a tremendous progress in the couple of years to come.
Thank you very much. On that note, maybe I also would like to ask South Africa to elaborate further, because you did touch at the end of your statement that one of the way forward would be to take up the issue and consider, you were talking about trilateral, which I assume was mostly on the health issue. But I understand that many developing and LDC countries also have interest in some other areas. Do you see any way forward in like some other colleagues have mentioned? Yeah.
I hope nobody's going to show the recording to my ambassador or my minister, because I think I'm going to agree with the DDG from the EU when she talks about.
We are in YouTube. They will see it.
I hope nobody shows them. I'm going to agree with the esteemed DDG when she talks about the need for accumulation of facts, and.
Thank you.
I think we need to move away from what can sometimes be an anecdotal discussion. And in that regard, I would certainly be of the view that Colombia's recent proposal for a review pursuant to Article 71 of the TRIPS agreement, this provides an opportunity to collect evidence about the implementation of the TRIPS agreement. So I would encourage all members to support this proposal and to use it among others for this particular purpose. Similarly, in terms of what you've mentioned, Madam Chair, about the interests of LDCs and other developing countries, we've seen a very enlightened, I would say, proposal from India, Colombia, Bangladesh, and Egypt, entitled TRIPS for Development, which raises critical issues such as pandemic preparedness, the need to reinvigorate WTO work on traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and the relationship between TRIPS and CBD. And on that note, I'd very much like to congratulate the WIPO for its move to the convening of a diplomatic conference on genetic resources. These are some of the important initiatives that have been led by developing countries that could certainly help us to reinvigorate the work under the TRIPS agreement and the TRIPS Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes, and I'm going to say again the questions, and then I will give the opportunity for both of you to maybe elaborate some of the point. But then I would like to give the floor to members and non-members who may have questions or have comments. So questions that have been led for the panelists in this section: domestic experience and linkage with other areas of work, policy in that country. So mainly domestic issue. Secondly is TRIPS work, and thirdly is a way forward. So if you have any additional points to add on these three questions, then please do so. And then I will open the floor. Yeah, just to finish at 5 as Wolf trying to send his strict eyes on
Is
you.
Wolf giving us the evil eye? Just very briefly, I think this came up in maybe it was Anthony Tubman's presentation, and the issue of notification, something that is near and dear to our heart. We would like to see a lot more notifications happening and discussion in the TRIPS Council. I think that's something that has been lagging a little bit. And one of the things also related to the work of the TRIPS Council, and again, this is a theme for the United States in all areas of the WTO, is looking for ways of getting input from outside stakeholders. and engaging more with stakeholders. We believe it's very important to hear from us as stakeholders, all sorts of stakeholders, and not just one side or another, those who create, those who benefit, and those who are impacted by the rules, because it is very important to hear from them here. We, of course, have those engagements back home in our domestic process, but we do think that it's important to do that here. I would also mention, and Marumo alluded to this, there have been calls for finally doing a review pursuant to Article 71.1 of the TRIPS agreement. So we are, supportive of those efforts. We want to work with other members and with the TRIPS Council Chair on how we go ahead and do that. Ambassador Pitfield, you have had some ideas for doing thematic sessions as part of this, where members can share their domestic experiences. So I think that, that would be something that we are, willing to work with others and would be interested in working with others. One idea maybe to start on something that's potentially less easier to handle, let me put it that way. But very important is the issue of enforcement against counterfeit goods. I think this was something that may have been highlighted in our 301, in our special 301 report just today. No need to say counterfeit goods pose significant serious health and safety risk for all people. And so it may be something to ease ourselves into that kind of work. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Maria. So, Ambassador Guilherme, yes, please.
Thanks a lot. I can also agree with the DG of the European Union to the effect that I think we have to protect creators and authors and musicians and performers more so now, I think, because of the digital economy and the implications that this has to their rights and to the income that they receive from their own individual works, and the threat that digital platforms today pose to them. In particular, I think in the developing world, some of the developing markets, world markets, have incredibly thriving music and movie industries, and they are suffering a lot with the advent of these platforms, which simply kind of globalize their work. And they get perhaps 1 cent per each time someone listens to their album on a Spotify platform. So I think this is an issue. Then there's the application of artificial intelligence, which picks up on segments of their work and then recreates them automatically and produces in split seconds hundreds and thousands of variations of their work that could be considered original work as well. So all these things are new challenges that we need. That's why we're presenting a permanent item on the SCCR at WIPO on a digital agenda, including AI. But so I guess the European Union will be supportive of this next time we meet. It has not been the case before, so let me just be frank and transparent. And I think we have a chance at WIPO with the disclosure of origin requirement. This was attempted here with the TRIPS CBD item on the TRIPS Council agenda. We managed to produce an agreement among some improbable countries, which were Brazil, India, European Union, and Switzerland on this, including GIs. Now we have a diplomatic conference at WIPO. So my last comment is, I think we have these organizations, they cannot continue working on silos, in silos. I think they have to cooperate. There's a trilateral commission, but it's mostly exchange of information. I think perhaps more substantive work could be performed in a mutually supportive basis. I think the pandemic treaty cannot end up without any provision on IP after all that has happened with COVID-19 and 7 million deaths. So I think, WTO is in a position to provide support, to get some reasonable provisions in there. I know there's a reluctance, again, on many countries that are very IP reliant to have any provision whatsoever. And as the political outcry with COVID has died down, I think the conditions now are much more difficult to get a decent agreement out. So these are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yes, I think at this stage, well, it did not surprise me that in the beginning of implementation of the TRIPS agreement was born, developing countries had different experience and concerns and, in different areas. But more and more, I think as the world, 30 years on, we have seen that interest in intellectual property protection, as well as how important it has been for countries' development has been becoming more visible and important than ever. Both Brazil and South Africa mentioned about digital economy, copyrights, and in the interest of, other members have mentioned these things in not only at the TRIPS Council but in other bodies in WTO as well. So I'm hopeful that the role and the recognition of how intellectual property is to all countries, North, South, whatever. I don't think this is a North-South issue anymore, but maybe that's me just being hopeful. But we have about 10 minutes. I would be, I think we can open for a couple of questions. If you have something to ask particular speakers, excluding me, and for comments, or you just, maybe some of our distinguished speakers would like to comment on the TRIPS agreement, but of course they will have their opportunity that. But so I'm giving the floor for some members who wish to say something. Yeah, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. It's good to it's good to see you since MC 13. Thank you, panelists. As we celebrate these 30 years, we're optimistic and encouraged by the strengthened collaborations we've seen with WTO, WIPO, and WHO, and the resolve and goodwill and what seems to be the conscience of our friends across advanced countries that together we will achieve reasonable, pragmatic, practical, and meaningful outcomes that will respond to one, access to essential medicines, which is very crucial for us, encouraging innovation and technology transfer, promoting foreign direct investment towards the ecosystem, capacity building, cultural and traditional knowledge protection, which was touched upon by the panel, and integration into the global economy. The question I have, that's a comment, the question I have is, from your lenses, how can we ensure that the implementation of TRIPS provisions takes into account the specific needs and realities of LDCs, balancing intellectual property rights protections with the promotion of our broader development goals? And the last question is, from your perspective, how do we meaningfully address our concerns as LDCs, particularly exploring our need and requirements for greater flexibility in pragmatic and adaptable implementation of TRIPS obligations that will ensure sustainability and swift response to access to essential medicines, promoting technology transfer, and safeguarding our traditional knowledge and cultural expressions? Thank you.
I'm not sure any body would like to take this up. Okay, EU, and maybe Marumo, you want to take this up for LDCs? Or?
No, I just want to make a point that I think has been underlined in a number of interventions, but it's very important in my view. The real impact of the TRIPS agreement and of the rules and the flexibility it contains, in my view, it can only be measured on the basis of the implementation in each individual WTO member. We're talking about a global treaty, but the impact of that treaty rests with the domestic implementation within national borders. I do remember at the time we were in the middle of the negotiations of the TRIPS waiver for COVID-19 vaccines. Some of us were closely involved in. And what came across as part of the problems we were facing was the fact that a number of the flexibilities and possibilities in the TRIPS agreement had not been implemented at national level. How can it be that countries like Germany or France were able to be faster in the rolling out of compulsory licenses when needed than developing countries. And that was part of the discussion we were having. And that's why I insist so much on the importance of looking into the individual implementation to be able to take advantage from the inbuilt flexibility that the negotiators injected in the TRIPS agreement at the time.
Okay, thank you very much. I think what nobody is obliged to answer, but yeah, I think if I would give another 1 or 2 minutes if somebody or all the panelists are free to finish us on the 5 o'clock time. So yeah, you can have 1, 2 minutes.
No, I was just going to echo what the other Maria said. That, and from our perspective, we are always willing to look at individual flexibilities on a case-by-case basis. And I think those of you who are here at the WTO on a day-to-day basis have heard me say this, in other contexts as well. So I do think that sometimes it's hard to look at, have the one rule or how it applies and try to figure out, well, how does it apply to 164 members? But when you look at, and I think others have referred to this earlier, if we have conversations that are more evidence-based, then it's a lot easier for all of us, certainly for me and for us, to understand what the problem is and what the potential fixes are. Because when you drill down to specifics, and it's easier to figure out what can I do, what can I live with, versus one blanket rule that applies to all. Thank you.
Not a concluding word so much as a response to the esteemed ambassador of Gambia. And I want to agree and echo again with the DDG from the EU in that members need to make use of the flexibilities that they have. And we fully support that idea. The reality, though, and indeed when you're faced with the responsibility of being a policymaker in a country that from, let us say, a global political economy perspective is not as powerful as others. There are inordinate pressures that come to the fore in order to prevent such members from making to the full use of their flexibilities. We've experienced that. And indeed, as I say, there's been international recognition of this through, among others, the United Nations high-level panel report. But at the end of the day, there is always a point where members have to show the political will. In our case, we thought that the TRIPS waiver, I'll go back to that. We thought that a multilateral response, a response not based on unilateralism, but a response based on a collective understanding, would have ameliorated some of these pressures. Regrettably, the outcome was that we are likely to see, in the case of future pandemics, more fragmentation. We're likely to see members taking upon themselves self-help measures. And as you say, Ambassador Carr, members have this responsibility, and members need to ensure that they use the IP system in a manner that benefits their people. And as was indicated by the ambassador or the DDG of the EU, there is the scope to do that, and members, even if it means that they need to do it on a unilateral and fragmented basis, it seems to be that that is the status quo. Thank you.
You want to have last word, Ambassador? Yeah. We have 1 minute.
Yes. Again, I like to agree a lot with everyone. So I also agree we should have fact-based discussions, but the facts are not particularly supportive of the TRIPS agreement or the IP system. So in fact, we had a crusade at WIPO to get the agenda development out. That was one of the major issues of negotiation 2007. And one of the elements there is to go beyond just the legal doctrine of IP and try to supported from also economic analysis, economic impact analysis, and other kinds of actual facts based on statistics. And now they have an economist there, actually, which is thanks to the pressure that was put on the institution to go just beyond legal dogma and try to get actual facts out. The facts all over the South are more or less around what our colleague from South Africa has indicated. It's the same in Brazil. It's about a 10 to 90 or 20 to 80 proportion between patents that are considered to nationals of the country in the South, in the developing country, and patents that are granted to multinational international corporations that are foreign to that country, but operate in that market. And then they gain a monopoly of exclusive rights, either to sell or block working or exploitation of that particular product in the market, because not always they use the patent to sell. They often use the patent to prevent others from selling, and they keep the market void of the product, or they simply use the patent to raise the price on the product because there's no competition. So I think the facts need to be out there. We have to go down that road. I think today there's a lot of renationalization of economic and trade policy all over the world, especially in the North. We speak of flexibilities, look one by one, but I think the EU representative herself indicated, why is Germany able to use compulsory licenses, whereas nobody else in the South is? I have the answer. I think it's quite obvious. Nobody in the South has the commercial strength, the critical mass in their domestic market, or the institutional, capacity to impose that on a huge, on a very important multinational corporation of the pharmaceutical sector, for example, because there are political pressures, because the judicial system is weak, so on and so forth. They don't have money. They don't have people to do that. They don't even have judges who understand, who are capable of judging a suit. They're so complex in that area. So it's a very weak system. The flexibility in the end is not for developing countries. It works for the developed countries, because Germany is not the only one who issued compulsory licenses during the pandemic. The US also issued. So that's the situation. I think we cannot just be so stingy to consider on a case-by-case basis small flexibilities that actually many developing countries are not even in a position to use. So we have to, I think the review of the TRIPS Treaty can bring about the opportunity to reconsider some of these things, in an honest perspective, with facts, with, and also with a kind of a human-centric approach. What are the consequences in terms of humans needing access to medicines, treatment, diagnosis, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just 2 minutes over. So I think very unfortunate that we have only this time, but we will continue with this topic for the way forward in the second panel, and then which are views from outsiders, real experts who have been engaging in this sector for a long time. So I hope we will get a little bit more details and information and ideas. For me, of course, what we heard is facts and evidence-based discussion in our way forward in the TRIPS Council. I hope that is one thing that we will do next year. So I will thanks again the speakers, and see you at the reception after this. Okay. I always go for the food. Okay, please. And yeah, so.
So we're all ready to go. So, so good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll move to the second panel for this afternoon.
Yes, exactly. I will let you do the honors.
So this is an example how the threat of retaliation is enough, it seems. So I won't need to use the gavel. So thank you very much for staying around for this final session, which I'm really excited about. It is, in fact, a perfect instance of be careful what you wish for, because we put together what we thought would be an ideal panel on the assumption that you might be 50% lucky to get those who invited. Incredibly, we have this all-star panel this afternoon, and we indeed have a bonus. We have two further highly eminent international experts who've joined us, and I'm going to sneakily try and get them into the conversation as well. Now, if you need an introduction to any of the panelists this afternoon, quite respectfully, you haven't done your homework, because I mean, if I were simply to list the key bibliography of what our panel has produced, the essential reading regarding TRIPS, our hour would be more than used up. So I'm going to be very blunt and brief in introducing the panel, because we want to hear what they say. Their incredible records as experts, as scholars, as practitioners speak for themselves. But to do the right thing procedurally, I welcome and acknowledge Edward Kwakwa, Assistant Deputy Director General in WIPO, Professor Carlos Correa, Executive Director, the South Centre, Professor Thomas Cottier, now with the World Trade Institute in Bern, a legendary TRIPS negotiator too, however, Professor Ruth Akeja from Harvard University, and Professor Fred Abbott, who's already been cited as an authority this afternoon, Florida State University, and Dr. Thierry Calamet from Lensenstel, a practitioner, a leading practitioner, voice and expert on TRIPS and its implementation. But I also acknowledge Professor Jerry Reichman and Professor Margot Bagley, two absolute leading experts in this field as well. And frankly, with this in front of us, I'm terrified about how we're going to use the remaining 50 minutes, but let's make the most of it. So what we've done for this session is to pose to our panelists three broad questions. We already have an established free-flowing conversation from the last panel, so I'm sure that culture will prevail. But let's at least start with the opening question, and I'll put it to each of the panelists in turn, and then let's see how it evolves from there. So the first question is the following: has the TRIPS agreement fulfilled its potential as an element of the international framework for the knowledge economy at a time now of dramatic technological change? And given what I hope we've been able to map a little, the diverse approaches to TRIPS implementation across the WTO membership, can we find wider policy insights or practical insights from that experience? So I turn first, we'll be a little bit diplomatic and turn to our international governmental organization partners first. So Edward Kwakwa, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tony. Good afternoon, distinguished delegates, participants. Tony, let me start by thanking you for the invitation to speak at this important commemoration conference. And I should also like to congratulate WTO on this important milestone, although I need to add In WIPO, we passed it long ago. So in respect of your question, quite clearly, dramatic technological change is an inevitable outcome of our individual and collective ingenuity. And so throughout the international intellectual property system, and I'm not just referring to TRIPS, I'm going as far back as the Berne Convention, the Paris Convention. They've had to grapple with technological change. So that's a given. And quite obviously, the relationship between technological change and intellectual property has never been static. So at WIPO, and I know you expected me to talk about WIPO, so if it's okay with the rest of you, that's all I'll be talking about today, what we are doing at WIPO, but in order to put emphasis on TRIPS. At WIPO, we continue to look carefully at the state of innovation and the role of the IP framework in driving growth and development in that specific regard. And I just want to mention our global innovation tracker as one of the tools that can help us all understand the complex future of innovation-driven growth. Now, Tony, in coming together to conclude the TRIPS agreement, it's clear WTO members, or I should say GATT members, as they were at the time, they wanted to support the operation of intellectual property in a dynamic trading system. So what they did was they carefully crafted a framework which balances building respect for intellectual property rights, but also ensuring that we take into account social and economic objectives. This is why the potential of the IP framework, including the TRIPS agreement, should be assessed in light of its ability to effectively meet the needs of all stakeholders. And when we say all stakeholders in WIPO, we want to stress we are not talking about a maximalist IP system. We are talking about an IP system that sees to the interests, not just of the owners of the IP system, but also the users of the IP. We want a balanced system to make sure this is acceptable to anyone who is in the IP ecosystem. We need to understand to what extent the system has enabled and has in fact managed to allow members, and here it's WTO members, to develop their domestic intellectual property frameworks. These are domestic frameworks that would ensure they meet the specific concerns of the WTO members. And of course, international organizations such as WTO and WIPO have a clear role to play in ensuring they are providing technical assistance to the members of WTO in respect of their domestic frameworks vis-a-vis the TRIPS agreement. And at WIPO, we work from delivering technical assistance, including cooperating with WTO on technical cooperation activities in relation to TRIPS. Most people tend to assume technical assistance under TRIPS is only given by the WTO Secretariat. But I need to remind you, WIPO also does provide extensive technical assistance under the TRIPS agreement. And in particular, this is assistance to developing countries and the least developed countries among the WTO membership. And we believe they are all increasingly aware how TRIPS may be implemented to meet their particular policy needs. So that's also something we take into account in providing this technical assistance. By the way, the technical assistance is provided upon request. And that's how come, for example, we have a WTO graduating LDC's technical assistance package we have crafted at WIPO specifically for the least developed countries who are graduating from their category. And we currently have it with Angola, with Laos, and with Sao Tome and Principe. since its launch. We've done it with all these countries extensively. And from my experience, it is apparent that the TRIPS agreement will continue to fulfill its potential to meet the needs of all members, 164 members. Well, I think it's 166 now. Of all the 166 members, and there needs to be continuing transparent communication, not just between the WTO members, but also between international organizations and all stakeholders. And of course, there will be new challenges. There will be new opportunities. These include climate change. These include artificial intelligence. And these will all drive the development of IP policy within the framework of the TRIPS agreement. So we need to continue taking these new developments into account. And we look forward to continuing to provide the required technical assistance for WTO's 166 members. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edward. As moderator, I think my biggest challenge will be moderating myself, because there's so much about that I'd like to take up, but I must absolutely acknowledge that the bulk of the work on technical assistance for TRIPS implementation is indeed carried out by WIPO, because of the frankly vast resources that we don't have and we're jealous of. I'd like to pass the floor now to Professor Carlos Correa, the Executive Director of the South Center. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. I intended to speak in Spanish, but I guess that most of you are following this in English. So I'll speak I'll speak a Latin American English. Okay, so let me start by saying that the previous panel has shown that perhaps we are not using the appropriate framework to consider TRIPS agreement and its role in particular in developing countries. Because the appropriate framework is to look not at whether patents should exist or trademarks should exist or copyright should exist in developing countries. We agree, for instance, there is a need to have copyright in order to protect local authors. The real question is whether we need or not minimum standards which are set by international organizations, that is the case of now the TRIPS agreement, which will eliminate the policy space for developing countries to adapt intellectual property to its needs and to level of development. So that's the question. It's not about whether patents or not should be granted, copyright or not should be granted, is whether the right approach was to have an agreement that provides for minimum standards mentioned by Ambassador Patriota, very high standards, and this was why developing countries needed to introduce massive changes into the national laws. So this is the first comment. The second comment is that this dogmatic view that intellectual property necessarily leads to more innovation and to more economic growth has no support. It's very interesting. And sometimes it could be even shocking. If you read the economic literature in the United States about the impact of intellectual property, you will find very few economists in the United States saying, this is great, this is really promoting innovation, economic growth. Most of them will say, we have no evidence. Some scholars, for instance, are even proposing to abolish the patent system in the United States because it may have a negative impact. So there is a lot of evidence, however, about the obstacles that intellectual property create in developing countries. Very clear the case of access to medicines, or also in relation to when seeds are patented, for instance. This means a real obstacle for farmers. So what I will encourage you to look at is that this from this point of view, intellectual property may play a role in terms of development. Yes, it depends very much on the context in which intellectual property is applied. But then what the proponents of the TRIPS agreement did was to say the same level of protection, the minimum level of protection, is good for all countries, independently of the level of development, technological development. And quite clearly, the purpose was not to help these countries to innovate or to get more technology transfer or more direct investment, foreign direct investment, was, as it was mentioned by a predecessor of Ambassador Patriota, Ambassador Recupero from Brazil, the very purpose was to freeze the comparative advantages of developed countries in terms of science and technology. When this agreement was negotiated, only 6% of the global research and development was accounted for by developing countries. This has changed somehow, but still Africa. In Africa, you have all kind of laws on patents, copyright, complying with TRIPS agreements, so on and so forth. How much contributes Africa to the global research and development? Around 1%. Latin America, 2.5%. Most is coming from developed countries and now Asian countries, in particular from India and China. So there is no evidence whatsoever that the TRIPS agreements have actually moved in the direction that more innovation is taking place in developing countries, even at the sectoral level. The proponents of the TRIPS agreement argue that it will bring about more innovation, transfer of technology, foreign direct investment. There is no literature actually supporting this view. But for instance, look at the pharmaceutical sector, one of the main proponents of the TRIPS agreement. Pharmaceutical sector was very much behind the TRIPS agreement. I would even say there will be no TRIPS agreement without the lobby of the pharmaceutical industry. But then, ironically, after the TRIPS agreement entered into force in developing countries in 2000, the innovation in the pharmaceutical sector went down dramatically in terms of new molecules. After 2000, the number of new molecules per year approved by FDA fell up to half of the previous decade. So there was no real impact in terms of innovation. So it was clear that TRIPS agreement was aimed at this freezing of the competitive advantages by developed countries. It was clear that developing countries accepted it in order to prevent unilateral measures. It was already mentioned. And it was part of some authors called this a grand deal. Developed countries said, if you wish anything in agriculture and textiles, you need to accept intellectual property. And as you know, developing countries, the conference took place in Punta del Este in 1986 that agreed to develop an instrument on intellectual property after long negotiations and a very ambiguous mandate. But then developing countries did not agree to enter into negotiation on what is today the TRIPS agreement until May 1989. So during all this period, developing countries said, this is not what we have agreed on in Punta del Este, and this is not in our interest. This is the interest of developed countries. So just to provide a context, and this coming back specifically to your question, Anthony, about technological change, yes, we need to adapt intellectual property to technological change, but this should be done in the national laws, taking into account the level of development, the impact of the laws. And for this, we don't need international standards, which may be, as it was the case for the TRIPS agreement, were essentially dictated by the interests of developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And now we turn to one of the negotiators indeed, the TRIPS agreement, who's since thought very deeply about the agreement and indeed its practical implementation. Thomas Cotier, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you very much for inviting me to this birthday party. I put down some notes setting off the scene and recalling the political situation at the time when TRIPS was negotiated, but there's no need for that because Ambassador Patriota, now Carlos, has done so and actually argued that nothing has really changed ever since. When in developing countries, clearly there was a prevailing view on import substitution as a doctrine which led logically to refute the use of intellectual property, and which was the heritage at the time of WIPO and the majorities there, and why the thing was moved into this building. You may also understand why I still remember having lunch with the Director General Bosch at WIPO, and he said to me, well, you're a nice guy, but from the wrong side of the road. Well, ever since then, I became a professor and I left diplomacy, and I'm looking at the TRIPS now from a more academic point of view. And the proposition I would like to make is TRIPS is perhaps the most important and successful multilateral treaty on multi-level governance here. It was quite risky at the time to set out the principles and also the standards. Some felt it too high, but I think time has proved that the approach has actually been successful. I would like to emphasize the importance of the rule of law, which it strengthens. I would like to emphasize the strengthening of property rights, and both of which development economists consider to be at the foundation of social and economic development. So the interaction between this agreement and the lack of tradition of the rule of law, etc., on property protection in many countries, I think needs to be taken into account when a critical assessment is made of TRIPS. At the time also, it was not quite clear whether TRIPS fits into GATT and this building here. A lot of trade economists said this is the wrong place. This is about free trade and not about monopolies. But I think today it is very clear, and also from what we heard, that intellectual property is really an ingrained part of the international trading system here. I would argue that today, despite the interventions we just heard, the fundamental contention is no longer there in reality, maybe in ideology, but not in reality, and that the real issues is about fine-tuning the system here. And a lot of the fine-tuning has been done also through dispute settlement. I think the dispute settlement record in IP is really astonishing. As a scholar, we all turn to the reports of the panels and to the appellate body. And I think it's worth recalling that intellectual property is not contentious in the debate on the appellate body. This debate is about trade remedies. It's not about, it's not even about the interpretation of Article 20 of GATT, and it's not contentious about the interpretation of the TRIPS agreement. And I think we have made so much progress in refining the rules through dispute settlement that this should be mentioned. I also would like to mention the paramount importance of MFN. When we negotiated the MFN clause at the time, it was to keep up equal treatment with the Americans in Asia. But today, the scope is much wider, because after the TRIPS agreement was adopted, as you all know, developments moved into preferential and plurilateral agreements and TRIPS plus elements outside of this house. But everybody is able to invoke these TRIPS plus elements under the MFN clause. So the MFN clause provides a common law of international property, intellectual property rights and equal conditions of competition, which I think is very, very considerate. Now, I would like to also address the question, where are the shortcomings? And there are substantial shortcomings, and I don't have much time, but the main point I'd like to make is that the belief in compulsory licensing as a major flexibility, in my view, is flawed and will not really produce the results we like to achieve here. I noted that maybe the US now no longer insists that using compulsory licensing is a bad thing, but my point is that given the complexity of the technology, given the global value chains, and given that we don't have any compulsory licensing on trade secrets, does not actually help you to bring about dissemination of technology. And to me, the big point in TRIPS where it has so far largely failed is to bring about dissemination of technology outside of commercial channels. I think the system works well with commercial channels. We might like to have some more competition rules in it as well, but it does not work where the funds are lacking. It doesn't work with the least developed countries. It doesn't work with developing countries who don't have the funds. And I like to come back to this in the challenge, in the face of the challenge of climate change in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas, for those thoughts. Now over to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much. I'm going to join everyone in saying thank you to Tony for both the invitation and to the entire team for putting this together. When I first began studying intellectual property, I was a college student. I had gone to my favorite professor of jurisprudence, and I said, you know, I've got to write this honors paper, and I have no idea what to write it on. And he said, you know, I just came from a strange meeting in Geneva, and there are a stack of pink papers in my office. Why don't you go take them and look at them and see if they provoke any interest? And that invitation changed my life. I went to his office, and back in the day, WIPO would have these, you know, conferences, usually about development and intellectual property, and they would print all of the papers on pink paper. And to this day, I have no understanding who picked that, but it certainly should be a WIPO trademark. So I read these papers and I was completely transformed. The topic of the conference was on the role of the patent system in technology transfer to developing countries. So mind you, I was, you know, 17 or 18 years old. I was writing this paper and I thought, there is no way this can be true. And that launched me on working on IP and development. So I want to make a couple of observations, pulling both from what Carlos, who is himself a hiding academic, as I call him, and including Dr. Kwakwa, who is also another hiding academic, and Professor Cartier. First, I think it's a huge mistake to assume that the TRIPS agreement captures the entire universe of innovation. In fact, a significant amount of innovative activity occurs outside of the formal framework of the intellectual property system. And this is probably one of the most significant challenges, in my view, to TRIPS itself. That to the extent that we think of TRIPS as creating this global framework in which all people of all races, from all generations, from every tongue and tribe and nation will somehow flourish within this balance of welfare and creativity, I think it's just an exaggeration, and also does a disservice to the many women, Indigenous people, entrepreneurs, informal actors all across sub-Saharan Africa, and frankly, almost in every sphere, Latin America, South America, who engage in creative enterprise every single day that is uncaptured by the IP system. And the TRIPS agreement doesn't capture this significant body of innovation and creativity and dynamism that occurs around the world. And I want to put this on the table explicitly because I think it's important to understand that TRIPS sits on this ecosystem of informal innovation. Professor Cartier has mentioned trade secrets, and there's a way in which trade secrecy, even though it's recognized and acknowledged and obviously a critical part of the innovation environment, trade secrecy is clearly not regulated in the same way that patents, copyrights, and trademarks are, and for a reason, right? Trade secrecy is the oldest form of intellectual property, and it is also the most anti-public version of it. Trade secrets are powerful, and they work hand in hand often with the patent system, and TRIPS doesn't quite get there for obvious reasons, but it means that we have to think about what the privatization of intellectual property means for the TRIPS agreement. Even in the context of dispute settlement, many of the disputes over intellectual property are resolved by platforms to which Tony made mention earlier. If you are accused of infringing music on YouTube, no one invokes the TRIPS agreement. They go to the terms of use. You typically are then heralded into a private method of dispute settlement. And we're seeing this happening in trademarks. We're seeing it happening in copyrights, in even in designs. So that if you take Tony's speech this morning and amplify it as the way the world is going, in other words, most of us will have our lives mediated by apps, then in many ways, the standards and the systems that we've put in place in TRIPS have both been modified, adjusted, and then privatized. So if you've ever had to defend the posting of your own article, to a YouTube dispute complaint system, you will experience this already. Or perhaps you've taken pictures of your grandchildren and you've posted them on Instagram and someone had said, take them down. I will make a confession. I recently had my research assistant issue a takedown notice for pictures of me that were on the internet, and I do not like to be on the internet. And so I've now started engaging in these systems, both to show the extent to which we've privatized intellectual property, but also to highlight the extent to which the TRIPS agreement has created an ecosystem that has allowed major platforms essentially to rule in the dispute settlement space quite significantly. So what has TRIPS in fact done? In a now very famous article, Professor Jerry Reichman, who is here, described the TRIPS agreement as a revolution. And indeed it was. It was radically different from the Paris Convention of 1883, the Berne Convention of 1886. Those treaties, which are incorporated by reference in the TRIPS agreement, had a very different world in which they operated. They also had a very different vision. Those treaties operated in a world in which individual inventors, individual artists, individual artisans needed the cross-border protection as they moved from one jurisdiction to the next. So the Venice, the first patent law that we know of, the Venice Patent Act, really was an act that both rewarded innovation, but also was a mode of immigration. So for almost every country that is a member of the WTO, there is a provision in your immigration laws that basically recognize innovators and creators as a special category. So there are many things that have not changed about the intellectual property system that TRIPS simply made visible. And I think that's one, in my view, one of the important accomplishments of the TRIPS agreement is that it made intellectual property no longer the domain of specialists and engineers. When I first wrote that paper in college, everyone asked my parents, what is intellectual property? Why is she studying it? She needs to do tax or something else that was completely mind-numbing to me. And I would get into a taxi and they would say, what are you? And I said, I'm a lawyer. And what do you do? And I'd say, well, I'm studying intellectual property. And then everybody would say, what's that? Today, you get into a taxi and you're talking with the Uber driver, the cab driver. And it is now common vernacular. And I think this is one of the things that TRIPS did. I also think that the TRIPS agreement transformed in a very formal way colonial regimes. So in 1994, by then I had been studying IP for about 10 years. And all of a sudden, there were all of these laws in former colonies that had to be changed. Now, most countries were independent in sub-Saharan Africa, but if you went and looked at the statutes, they all still bore the colonial stamp. So the TRIPS agreement forced a modernization, for good or for bad, of these laws in many former colonies. Now, let me say that in deference to Edward, the WTO did it better. If you look at how developing countries became part and parcel of the Berne Convention and of the Paris Convention, it did not look anywhere close to the sort of at least pretend democratic way in which we got the change through TRIPS. But it also then, in doing so, elevated intellectual property in a very different manner, and that has not been mentioned today. Intellectual property was not part of many law school curricula. And so what happened when TRIPS got signed in 1994 was there was a rapid curricular change in many law schools, many business schools, many schools of arts. Why? Because there were no real doctrinal IP lawyers. We had a shortage of IP professors. We had a shortage of IP lawyers. There was an entire infrastructure that was built around the TRIPS agreement that I think is an important contribution to the innovation that we have today. And last, it institutionalized practices. All of a sudden, for those of you who have friends or children or nieces and nephews who are IP lawyers, we began to see institutions spring up, not only in patents, but organizations that were rallying around the question of standards, the questions of access to knowledge, access to medicines. We began to see new areas of emphasis, the relationship between intellectual property and climate change, the relationship between intellectual property and development. And really, these were concerns happening at WIPO for many years, but the TRIPS agreement catalyzed a formalization of these questions. So there are still, of course, some challenges, and I think Carlos has mentioned them. I think it is a myth to think that intellectual property laws promote or even produce development. But I do want to say that the effective use of IP requires an ecosystem of innovation. You need educational institutions. You need healthy people, healthy citizens. You need environments that remain vibrant and diverse. And you need access to capital. You can drop the best IP regime in any country, and if it lacks an innovation ecosystem, those IP laws simply will not function. And this is a shortcoming both for WIPO and for the WTO. I also lastly want to say that the TRIPS agreement transformed the nature of the public-private divide. You know, TRIPS is a public law. It is a law that governments have to implement, and we can talk about implementation a bit later. But at the time of TRIPS, there were no lawyers in most developing country governments who knew either trade law or intellectual property law. So again, the catch-up was not just a technological catch-up. The catch-up was an educational catch-up, it was a cultural catch-up, and it was an institutional catch-up. So it's no wonder that many of the costs of TRIPS implementation has fallen so heavily for developing countries. And ultimately, what we're beginning to see in countries like India and in Brazil and in Argentina and South Africa and Nigeria, we're beginning to see a cadre of public lawyers who are just now, 30 years after the TRIPS agreement, the first generation of these lawyers who have been trained and who have learned the doctrines and the strategies and the processes of the TRIPS agreement. And it's hard to tell where the future will take us now that this first generation is emerging. But the problems are real, from access to knowledge to access to medicines. There remain big challenges about the wiggle room that TRIPS allows and how we interpret that wiggle room and which governments will be able to use it for the benefit and for the welfare of their people.
Thank you very much, Ruth. That must have been a spectacular honours thesis. I'm very glad that those cubic meters of pink documents that used to clog up my office had some social value. And I would say if anyone out there is looking for topics for their honours thesis, I would recommend that you just rewind what you've just heard. I lost count, but I think there's 10 or 12 really live topics for research that Ruth laid out in front of us. So we now turn to Fred Abbott, who's already been cited as an authority several times this afternoon, and who's signalled that, Fred, you've refreshed your thoughts already as a result of what we're discussing.
Well, of course, I remind you all of the central question of science fiction, that is, will we survive first contact? And naturally, the question for someone who's the 17th speaker on a panel on 30 years of TRIPS has to ask whether there's anything that hasn't yet been said. And so I start by Ambassador Patriota, who in detail reminded us of where the TRIPS agreement actually came from, and Carlos Correa, who echoed that it wasn't designed to create a knowledge economy, it was designed to protect first world assets in the third world. That's not a value judgment about IP. It doesn't tell you whether IP is good or bad, promotes innovation or not, but it's the realistic starting point of where this comes from. And whether or not patents and other IP encourage innovation, Carlos is skeptical, says no. Thomas is not skeptical, says yes. The best I can do is remind us of one of the great, if not the greatest economist of the 20th century on IP work, that is Fritz Machlup, who when asked whether the United States should continue to have a patent system said, well, I don't have any empirical evidence to support it, but we have a patent system and we have innovation. So it seems to be working, so I'd be hard pressed to recommend getting rid of it. We might say the same thing about the TRIPS agreement. We have innovation, it's there. What's the objective evidence for getting rid of it? It's not a ringing endorsement, but it's a statement of where we might stand. One thing that hasn't been very much mentioned, and I'd just like to emphasize, is that globally, it's not just the WTO. We've entered a period of, I'll call it delegalization. That is, you can say that the WTO, when it started in 1995, was an experiment in trying to deeply legalize the international trading system. Since that time, we've really had a lot of pushback in that area. We've seen this problem all across the international community, whether it's the United Nations or really any other international organization, the World Health Organization. It's hard to get agreement on anything. And you also see problems being solved without legal recourse. So my prime example is the agreement between the United States and China, the first economic agreement to try to settle some of their major economic disputes. And if you look at how disputes are resolved under that agreement, they're not taking to legal dispute settlement at all. It's turned over to the trade ambassadors, and you're asked, can you solve this problem? If not, your remedy is to back out of the agreement. There's no legal recourse. And I'm afraid we've reached a point in international relations where technology issues have become so intense, particularly in the military technology area and the cyber area, that it's very difficult for governments now to try to resolve these issues. And I'm reminded, of course, of Arthur Dunkel's law and its limitations in the GATT multilateral trading system, the seminal work in this area, who pointed out that you can't really settle everything with legal rules in the international sphere. Now, I'll just spend 30 seconds on the third point, which is trilateralism. So today, when the TRIPS agreement was concluded, the real idea was the center of gravity was shifting to the WTO. We've heard about the concerns. Well, it's quite evident over the past 6 or 7 years that that center of gravity is shifting back. Today, my work, I mean, this is just me personally, I spend a third of my time at the WHO, I spend a third of my time at WIPO, and I spend a third of my time at the WTO. They're all talking roughly in the same area. Transfer of technology discussions are going on in all of these places. I work a lot on the local production of medicine and transfer of technology, and you can't really deal with one without dealing with the others. WIPO is doing very good work on transfer of technology, research in this area, training programs, and so forth. And that ties into work at the WHO, where we're trying to encourage the local production of medicines in Africa, and how you solve those issues, which ties into another point. I'm trying to be brief. You can't ignore the fact that today intellectual property is important in an area like local production of medicines. These are contracts that involve transfers of technology. They involve patents. They involve trade secrets. They involve confidentiality. They involve identifications. They involve how materials and equipment are going to move from point A to point B. And so if you are a technologist and a business person in a developing country, you can't really ignore intellectual property, whatever you may think of whether or not it's promoting innovation or not. It's the mechanism by which technology is transferred. Well, Well, I'll briefly just mention, I spent the past 2 days here at WTO in a meeting for the least developed countries in their workshop, their annual workshop. And I just want to say very briefly with respect to Article 66.2, we're really seeing a lot of progress for a provision that really wasn't given much content. The least developed country members have really put a lot of work into identifying their technology needs, and we have a major challenge of trying to marry the technological needs, which often involve things as simple as tractors in agriculture and irrigation systems, seemingly, and not always the highest tech type of technology. We had some very productive discussions this past week about how to work out those things better. Finally, a point that was made already by Marumo and the delegate from the European Union. I have to confess I was a bit disappointed at the outset of the pandemic when we started to have a discussion about a waiver of the TRIPS agreement rules. And it may just have to do with my age and experience. But we've spent the past 20 years talking about TRIPS flexibilities and how important they are, and getting the Doha Declaration and traveling around the world explaining to people, here's what you have to do in national law. Here's what you can adopt. Here's your flexibilities. And so when a pandemic came, my reaction was, if you need to use the intellectual property, you know how to use it. The tools are there. We've reaffirmed their utility. Now, what Marumo pointed out, and I think is very important, is, you know, for me, that's easy enough to say, right? But maybe all of the developing countries haven't put these things sufficiently into national law. So my central message is, before the next pandemic, get this stuff into your national law, do it right. There's many ways that you can improve your access through effective domestic implementation. Getting a waiver at the WTO doesn't change your national law. You're still going to have to get it through your national legal system. And unless you modify your national legal system to make these things possible, and Carlos and I both also said, and at the end of the day, if you haven't done any of that, invoke Article 73. It's a national security issue. You can override anything you want. Nobody's going to give you trouble for addressing a pandemic and saving half your population. You think the WTO dispute settlement body is going to say you should have killed 1 million people instead? So these are an interesting abstract question, but there's ways you could address them without, you know, any dramatic undertakings. I'm sorry, that was probably longer than 5 minutes.
There was a lot in that 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Fred. Now, we wanted to make sure the panel also, we heard from people, or at least a person who does this for a living, who actually works in the IP system. So Dr. Calame, a leading practitioner, but also with a great nose for policy. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tony. Yes, indeed. And thank you also for the invitation from my side. It's a great honor to be on this panel with such learned experts whose works have inspired me in my daily work as a practitioner. So actually, the first comment that I wanted to make, and I'm only going to make 3 comments in the interest of time, but the first comment I'd like to make is that, you know, in the question, actually, reference is made to the knowledge economy and to dramatic technological changes. This might imply that the TRIPS should prioritize invention in these areas. Of course, it's very important, it's essential to update the IP frameworks to technological change. I wouldn't disagree with that. But at the same time, I would just like we should remember that the TRIPS agreement really is technology neutral and should not discriminate as far as certain technologies are concerned. But the question really asks about, you know, has the TRIPS agreement fulfilled its potential? You know, various things have said. One of the aspects that I personally, as a practitioner, find really crucial has not been mentioned so far, and that's really the integration of IP disputes into the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism. This really is a very important platform for resolving disputes between member states. And there have been a number of cases where WTO's dispute settlement process played a pivotal role in resolving the matter. And actually, Mr. Professor Abbott just talked about, creating IP norms outside the TRIPS through other, agreements, multilateral agreements, bilateral or regional agreements. And in my view, that is really one of the main drawbacks of developing new IP norms outside the TRIPS. It's really the absence of a WTO dispute resolution mechanism in these kind of alternative arrangements. Let me just make a final comment, because Tony's question asked about, practical insights from diverse approaches to implementation, TRIPS implementation. So for me as a practitioner, what is really crucial is how WTO members adopt international treaties into domestic law. And let's take the example of Switzerland, where I'm from, which operates under a monist system as opposed to a dualist system. So here, international law becomes part of domestic law without the need for further action. So sufficiently specific TRIPS provisions are directly applicable and enforceable in Swiss courts. And me, personally, as an IP practitioner before the courts, have experienced several instances where the TRIPS agreement was relied on and directly applied. Just let me give you kind of practical examples. One of my clients' trademark, didn't have a word mark in Switzerland, and the device mark was actually found invalid for non-use, but his mark was recognized as being well known on the basis of the TRIPS agreement, Article 16. There have been copyright cases where the three-step test in Article 13 has been directly applied by the Swiss courts. And because exhaustion was actually mentioned before, let me just mention a case where the Federal Supreme Court decided that national exhaustion applies in patent law. The court well recognized that Article 6 of the TRIPS agreement provides that the TRIPS agreement really does not apply to exhaustion. This is up to the national system, but the court relied on the travaux préparatoires of the TRIPS agreement to really kind of foster the decision. So direct applicability from a practitioner's point of view is really key and should be encouraged. So other courts should follow suit to the extent their domestic law allows them to do so. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you very much, Thierry, for those insights. Now we have reached 6 o'clock, which has practical implications. Firstly, it's my pleasure to acknowledge and thank the interpreters who have been working hard to make sense of what we're all saying, and that with their flexibility, we just have a few more minutes. Equally compelling is the fact that there is this famous Thai food just outside. But at the same time, we do have an incredible panel in front of us. So I think the way to deal with that is to invite each panel member just to offer us a specific observation, a specific insight that we should take away and work on. The themes that we were thinking of talking about include the impact of TRIPS on international governance generally, including the relationship with WIPO, but beyond. The fact that so much norm setting has been taking place outside of TRIPS, bilateral agreements, other agreements, in WIPO as well, and then what this means for the future of TRIPS. Now, I've already used up most of the time in posing the question, but I'd be really grateful if we could just get a snapshot from each panel member very quickly in the same order. Edward, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Tony. So you talk about norm setting taking place in places outside of WTO. And unfortunately, I'll have to say my organization is guilty of that. So in the last decade alone, we've adopted at least 3 or 4 treaties on different areas of intellectual property. And I'm happy to note, as was mentioned, there is one coming up in May next month and another one in November in Saudi Arabia. May will be here in Geneva. These are all different areas of intellectual property. And Professor Okediji, I'm happy to say next month, if all goes well, we will start incorporating indigenous peoples, genetic resources, and other underserved areas in the intellectual property system. Finally, I think Fred already mentioned the trilateral cooperation, and I think it's vital WTO, WIPO, and WHO continue this important linkage that's making the 3 organizations very effectively bring their respective expertise in IP, in trade, and in health to the benefit of their respective member states and in WTO's case, members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Carlos, your quick thoughts.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to respond in 1 minute. But let me just mention that the TRIPS agreement contains some elements for its own evolution. One of them was the review of Article 27.3b. The article says it will be reviewed in 4 years. It never happened. There's also provisions for further negotiations on geographic indications. They started, they never ended. There is the review every 2 years, Article 71. It was already mentioned by the representative from South Africa. It has never happened. So the TRIPS agreement has some elements that may allow it to evolve to some extent. The only evolution that we had was the adoption of 2 waivers. The first one, the waiver that then ended up as being Article 31 bis, and the TRIPS waiver that was recently adopted. But interestingly, these 2 waivers address the problem created by one single provision. And this is Article 31, paragraph F, which establishes that compulsory licensing, that I think is a valuable tool, disagreeing with Professor Gautier, can only be granted in order to supply predominantly the domestic market. And it's very interesting because nobody knows the rationale for this provision and why it is there. And then if we are thinking, as this was one of your questions, Anthony, about TRIPS 2.0, I think this is one of the provisions that needs to be considered for deletion because it created so much problem. So why is it there? We don't know. And also that we need to avoid the non-violation. Non-violation has been there also, and there is no reason whatsoever to apply non-violation to TRIPS issues. Improve, I think, Article 66, paragraph 2. The wording is too weak in order to ensure that transfer of technology takes place. The disclosure obligation, as it was mentioned, it was brought to the WTO. The possible revision of Article 29, it never happened. It's different from getting a treaty in a couple of weeks in WIPO, because if this will become part of the TRIPS agreement, would apply to all members of the WTO. So this is not the case. So there is still room in the context of the TRIPS agreement to see some evolution and, of course, interpretation by the panels and eventually the appellate body, if it comes back, will be useful in order to have some evolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So much there to think about. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you. Well, to develop an agenda in 30 seconds is rather difficult, but it seems to me that the committee should certainly deal with artificial intelligence, which is challenging the whole concept of copyright, and we need to find answers to that. Secondly, I think there is a threat that recourse to national security interests in the current geopolitical configurations increasingly erodes disciplines in the TRIPS agreement, and that is fateful in the field of climate change. I think we need to work hard on bringing about a system which allows transfer of climate mitigation and adaptation relevant technologies to all countries in need. And my caveat is don't just beg on compulsory licensing. Even if you implement everything, I think what we should do is to work on a code on public-private partnerships. There are a lot of difficult IP issues there which are unresolved, And I think this should be something WIPO and the World Health Organization and the WTO should make good use of their being together in Geneva and work on that subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Plenty of ideas for future work, at least. Ruth, what should the
Thank you.
The research scholars of today get to work on?
Well, I'm not sure it's just the research scholars. I mean, all of us hope that our work has practical implementation, implications. So I'm going to rattle off a number of things. First, I think that the TRIPS Council has proven to be an important incubator. It's a place where ideas are really kind of cast out, debated, thought through. I think the TRIPS Council also is a wonderful filter, helping to channel what issues end up at WIPO versus what stay within the WTO. And I really think that the council maintains an important role in that regard. But we all should remember that law will always lag behind technology. That's just the reality. And so there's never going to be an agreement that sort of matches the state of the technological frontier. That's not going to happen. So what TRIPS has done, and frankly, the Bern and Paris as well, is created opportunities for evolution, but not so much for transformation and change. And we've got to manage that tension really well. That means, to me, competition law has to rise. I think we're all seeing, whether it's with the platforms or even whether it's institutional concentration, we need to think about this interface between competition and IP, both for health and for climate, and generally and with regard to public goods. Last, education, education, education. Technical assistance is not the same thing as education. We need to invest in the capacity of institutions to deliver IP education, innovation education, competition education, so that the conversations are happening locally, regionally, and in Geneva.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Fred, any final?
I will limit myself to 3 short sentences. Intellectual property is neither inherently good or bad. It is what people do with intellectual property that can either be good or bad. These are conscious choices made by people. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm fond of quoting the song, it ain't what you got, it's how you use it, even more dramatically. So thank you for your brevity and clarity. Thierry, final word from you.
We should probably stop here because those words were really good final words. I don't want to stand between the Thai food and this panel, so I'm happy. Thank you. I said it.
Well, thank you all very much. I really did want to acknowledge and invite Jerry Reichman and Margot Bagley to join in, but I guess it's rather unfair to impose this on them given what we have in front of us. So I really encourage you to approach them over a drink and over a snack. But this has been a fantastic panel. Frankly, I knew it would run over time. It was just a gravitational fact. But my God, it was worth it. I really, really appreciate there's such a rich set of ideas for us to think about, to work on, and I hope for our members in particular to reflect on as we try to reinvigorate a discussion about the way forward. So I'll leave it at that, just again expressing warm thanks to our panel and to all of you for staying the distance and joining us. So thank you. And if you find this addictive, on Monday and Tuesday we have a much more low-key, geeky symposium. So please to join us there if you can. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the reception. So the reception is downstairs in the main atrium. So see you down there.
They have litigation in German, is it?
Yeah, well, we litigate. I mean, I also litigate in the French-speaking part, and we like before the patent court, we can even litigate in English.
In English?
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's recognized. You can actually do it. Yeah.
So it gives the opportunity for other attorneys to compete, but they need to